Okay, so, let me tell you something. You can tell I haven't streamed in a while because for whatever reason, OBS likes to say that I have been streaming, but right next to the stop streaming button, there's a little button that says go live, which I thought I did. I thought I had it set up so that I would be streaming live, but apparently I wasn't. I was talking to myself. Alright, so in case this recording didn't get through properly, uh, I'm going to go through and have my own separate stream for Card Shop Simulator. Again, just separate from the first playthrough I did a while back, as well as the separate single streams that I've done. This is going to be its own thing. I'm going to try to do it for like streaming only. And of course, I'll be streaming as long as I can with this for multiple parts, trying to make sure I get what I can and try and stay up to date with like all the updates and such. And bottom right corner, I will have videos from the dual logs playing, just some of the hour-long videos that they've got on Yu-Gi-Oh. I know they have one for Pokemon, but I think we're just going to stick with Yu-Gi-Oh just because that's the one I'm a little bit more familiar with compared to like Pokemon or Magic even. Okay, so let's go ahead and get the video going.
The first thing you need to know about any card game is how to win. In Yu-Gi-Oh, your deck is 40 to 60 cards, and if your deck ever reaches 0 and you have to draw a card and
Okay,
can't,
I
then
think
you
the
lose the
audio for
duel.
this is
Additionally, both players start with
going just fine.
8,000 life points.
All
This
right.
life total is interacted with throughout the game.
Welcome to Foxxy Cards. Let's go ahead and get started.
You automatically lose the duel. Also, rarely some cards will have effects which instantly win you the duel, like getting all 5 pieces of Exodia in your hand. These are called instant win effects, and will detail how to instantly win the game with their effects on the cards.
I want to put my
These are not common at all, and you'll rarely
I don't like
see
the placement of
people pull
that.
these win conditions off in competitive duels. The most common way to win is to reduce your opponent's life points to 0 using a combination of your monsters attacking your opponent's life points directly. When you're starting your turn, you draw 5 cards. At the start of each of your turns, you get to draw 1 additional time. And this happens during the draw phase, which exists on a point of other phases. You have the draw phase, the standby phase, the main phase, battle phase, the main phase 2, and then the end phase. And these are all the phases you'll be seeing pretty much every turn throughout a duel. To go over the phases in more detail, the draw phase is just where you draw a card. So, if you draw a card, you immediately just draw before anything happens, because neither you nor your opponent can do anything before you draw a card. So it's always the first thing that happens when you start a turn. However, there are sometimes effects which happen in place of the draw, like how Flame Tiger can replace your draw in order to special summon itself from the graveyard. However, after you draw a card, your opponent is free to use all kinds of different quick effects which can be used during any phase, which will go
And
over
one
later.
more.
But because they can use things after you draw, you have to declare that you're leaving the draw phase and entering the standby phase next. Generally, this is just by saying standby phase, and your opponent can tell you to wait before you move on. The standby phase is just what happens after the draw phase and before your main phase 1. By game mechanics, nothing really happens here. The standby phase basically exists for card effects to have their costs paid, because there are a lot of costs that happen and effects that happen during the standby phase, like paying the cost of Mirror Wall to stay on the field. Even though nothing typically happens during the standby phase, you still have to declare that you're entering the standby phase in paper.
Just need to set the price and we'll be ready to open.
Wants to do something during the phase. Then you enter the main phase 1. This is where all the magic happens. You essentially play 90% of Yu-Gi-Oh! During the main phase, and 75% of that happens during the main phase 1. During the main phase 1, you have a couple of things you can do by game mechanics, and the most important one is your 1 normal summon per turn. Let's take a little detour from main phase 1
total comes
in order
to 15.
to explain the types of cards at Yu-Gi-Oh! In Yu-Gi-Oh! There are 3 types of cards: monsters, spells, and traps. Monster cards are basically cards that you put on the field and exist permanently, until some other card or effect puts them in the graveyard. Spells and traps are a lot more temporary. You can play as many spells from your hand as you can activate their effects, and traps can only be activated a turn after you set them on the field face down. However, monsters cannot be played infinitely from your hand like spells and traps. You can only play 1 monster from your hand onto the field, because it's a really permanent fixture. But there's even more rules to it. You can only play a monster that's level 4 or lower to the field, and you can tell a monster's level by the amount of stars they have in the upper right-hand corner. If you want to play a higher level monster, you must tribute monsters
Exact
in order
change
to bring
so
it up
far.
from
That's
your
been
hand with your
very
normal
nice.
summon. A tribute is simply sending a monster from your field to the graveyard in order to immediately place the monster from your hand on the field. If a monster
I don't want to
is
open up
level
these
5
cards
or
right now, but I
6
think I'll wait.
specifically, you need one monster as a tribute and your normal summon available. If a monster is
$12.
level 7 or higher, you need at least 2 monsters as tributes and your normal summon available.
Nice not having to
Sometimes
worry about
monsters will have
taxes.
artifacts which state you need even more tributes, but those aren't covered by the basic rules of the game and are technically part of the card's effect that you can just read on the card itself. So back to the main phase 1. You're allowed to perform one normal summon per turn.
12 packs,
You can
nice.
then place one of your level 4 or lower monsters from your hand onto the field.
Enjoy.
In either face-up attack position or face-down defense position. When a monster is face down, your opponent doesn't know what the card is until something reveals it, which is usually a monster attacking into it, where it's revealed during the damage step, which is a surprisingly complicated step that we'll cover later. Normally, you want to play monsters in face-up attack position. You cannot normal summon a monster into face-up defense position, despite the fact
that is
they do
something
this
that the
lot
anime
in
does a
the
lot,
anime
where
it's based on.
players summon
Additionally,
the
there are
monsters
some
in
other things
face-up
you get from a
defense.
monster once per turn. During the main phase, you're allowed to change the battle position of a monster as long as it's not the turn that it was summoned. So on your first turn, if you normal summon a monster in face-up attack position, you cannot then put it into defense position.
Right.
You have to wait until your next turn. Additionally, if you wish to attack with a monster, it needs to be in attack position, which is why these positions matter in the first place. Also, if your monster attacked and it's a different turn from when it was summoned, you cannot place it into defense position during the main phase too. Because a
you can
monster
either
cannot change
switch
its battle
positions
position
or
after it has
attack. You can't
declared
do
it attacked
both.
that turn. But if you change your battle position before you attack, then it's fine. If a monster is face down and it's a different turn from when it was summoned, you can reveal it by doing something that's called a flip summon. A flip summon is simply changing a monster from face down defense position to face up attack position. You cannot flip summon a monster into face up defense position, so there's a risk to flipping up a low attack flip monster. A flip summon, despite being called a summon, does not count as your normal summon for the turn. It only counts as a summon for the effects of cards that specifically count summons, like Nibiru or Summon Limit. But for the most part, a flip summon doesn't matter, and you rarely perform them anyway in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! The main phase is also where you can activate all of your spell speed 1 effects. In Magic the Gathering, this is called sorcery speed. But let's go over the spell speeds real quick in order to explain what you can do during the main phase. In Yu-Gi-Oh! There are 3 types of game speeds, and they are simply called spell speeds 1 through 3. In Magic the Gathering, there are 2 spell speeds, and each one has their own little fancy name for them called sorcery speed, which is spell speed 1 in Yu-Gi-Oh!, and instant speed, which is spell speed 2 in Yu-Gi-Oh! So a spell speed 1 card is an effect which can only be activated during the main phase and can only be activated at the very start of a chain. For example, if you want to play a Pot of Desires to draw 2 cards. This is a spell speed 1 card, so you can use it during your main phase, and you just play the card from your hand onto the field, and you pay its cost immediately in order to activate the card from your hand. Then you ask your opponent if they have a response. A response can only be spell speed 2 or higher. So your opponent wouldn't be able to play their Pot of Desires from their hand, for example. But they could use Jar of Greed if they had one face down already, because it's a trap card. And every single trap card is spell speed 2 or higher. All monster effects are spell speed 1 by default unless stated otherwise, which means you can only activate them on a clear game state, and not in response to anything else, which is the opposite of Magic the Gathering, funnily enough, because all of their card effects are spell speed 2
hearing these referred to as spell speeds.
If you summon a Judgment Dragon to your side of the field, and you want to use its ability to destroy all the cards on the field, you have to wait until after your opponent gives you the okay from the summon. Because after you summon a monster, your opponent is allowed to react in some way to your summon with a spell speed 2 or higher effect. So, for example, if you summon a Judgment Dragon and you want to destroy the field, you have to then wait for your opponent to give you okay to use its effect after the summon. So, if they have a face-down Raikou,
you're selling me a card I can't even afford.
Summon in order to destroy Judgment Dragon, it means it never gets to use its effect because
you
it
buy...
was too slow. This is
I don't
why
think you
spell
bought any
speeds are
cards for me
important,
yet.
because you can outspeed spell speed 1 effects on monsters pretty easily. However, spell speed 1 effects on spells happen almost instantly and are not as easy to stop, because as soon as you activate a spell card, its effect will take place after it resolves. whereas a monster has to hit the field first and then activate its
What do you
effect
want?
later. So there's an opportunity to get rid of the card before it ever gets a chance
No
to
thank
do
you.
that, unless its effect specifically triggers on its summon.
I
Spell
gotta buy
Speed
more
3
cards, hold
is
on.
exclusively for counter trap cards, and you cannot activate any cards or effects in response to a
I'm
Spell
sure
Speed
he's
3
gonna,
effect,
yep.
except for other Spell Speed 3 effects. So basically, you can only use counter trap cards in response to other counter trap cards. This is a very important distinction because there are some monsters with Spell Speed 2 effects which can stop your plays, and you can't stop their plays with a Spell Speed 3 counter trap card as there's nothing they can do to stop
Oh
it,
yeah, Magic
unless
Jammer.
they have their own Spell Speed 3 counter trap card. Now, let's go back to the main phase 1. During the main phase 1, you're able to use all of your Spell Speed 1 effects. So, if you have a whole bunch of normal spell cards in your hand, you can just use all of them in your hand during this phase. So if your deck
You
is full of
can.
nothing but spell cards which draw you cards, you could theoretically draw through every single card in your deck during your main phase 1, because Yu-Gi-Oh! Does not have a resource system to stop you from just using every spell card in your hand. This is why most spell cards which draw you cards are really bad, or have really harsh restrictions on them. However, trap cards, which draw you cards, are, funnily enough, just not as valuable. Because while you can play as many traps from your hand on your turn as you like, just like spell cards, trap cards have a rule where they cannot be activated the turn they are set. So if you have a full hand of Jar of Greeds, which only draw you one card, you can't actually use any of them until you pass your turn. So
Pretty
for
much, yeah.
example, you set 5 Jar of Greeds, which normally you can't do because you can only play 3 copies of a card in your deck, but we'll just ignore that for now. Then that is your whole turn because you have no other cards in your hand. So you have nothing left to do but just pass turn to your opponent. Then after your opponent draws a card during the draw phase, you do have the opportunity to use all 5 of your Jar of Greeds, because you can activate trap cards pretty much whenever you want during any phase. So you'll draw 5 cards during your opponent's draw phase with the effect of Jar of Greeds, but you can't use them until your next turn because you can't play cards in your hand during your opponent's turn. And your opponent can just reduce your life points to 0 in one turn pretty easily on an empty board, so those new 5 cards you drew are basically worthless. And this is why trap cards, which draw cards, almost have no restrictions on them, or very little restrictions, and almost never see any competitive play, because just having to wait one turn to use them is just too
Okay, I was
slow
wondering
in
if
modern
the
Yu-Gi-Oh! As modern
video
Yu-Gi-Oh!
was
is
going because
over
it's
in
been
about
stuck on
30
that screen
turns.
for quite
During
a
the
while.
main phase, you're also able to perform an extra deck summon, whether that be a fusion summon, link summon, synchro summon, XC summon, or a pendulum summon. Yu-Gi-Oh! Has a lot of different extra deck summoning methods, and all of them have to be done during the main phase 1, and rarely do you do them outside of the main phase without some kind of extra card effect. Now, there is another type of summon called the special summon, which is generally performed during the main phase 1 as well. A special summon
Yep.
is unlimited. You can perform as many special summons during your turn as possible. The only limitation is the amount of cards you have in your hand to perform those special summons. So theoretically, if every single card in your deck had the effect, you could special summon this card from your hand and draw a card. You could special summon every single card from your deck in one
Oh
turn,
god.
as long as you had the space on your field, because you are limited to 5 normal monster zones. So, for
28
example,
packs,
say you
good
have
lord,
a card
man.
like Cyber Dragon, which has the effect where you can special summon it from your hand if only your opponent controls a monster, which
May as
means
well
your
bought a
opponent
booster
has
box.
to have at least one monster and you have 0. You would be able to bring this card out from your hand in face-up attack position or face-up defense position, but because of the rules of Cyber Dragon's own effect, you would not be able to bring out a second one from your hand because you no longer meet its conditions. This is basically how they restrict special summons, because it's so powerful. Either you need to meet very specific conditions for them to come out, or they have a hard
Another big
once per
spender here.
turn on that fact, so you can't bring out multiples. So because Cyber Dragon has the condition where you
Thank
need
you.
to control no monsters, if you bring out a Cyber Dragon from your hand, then you can't bring out another one because you no longer meet the conditions. But if your opponent destroys your Cyber Dragon and you have another one in hand, then you can bring it out immediately. And the rules for special
True.
summon a monster to the field are very different from a normal summon, in that they ignore levels. So even though Cyber Dragon is level 5, you don't have to tribute a monster to bring it out. And they ignore the face-down defense position rule, where a special summon monster can only be in face-up attack position or face-up defense position, because you
Oh,
can't
hold on,
hide
folks,
the
hold
effects
on.
of a special summon monster. And the only way to special summon monsters face down
Dude, I'm
is
trying
with
to
a card
stock up.
effect that specifically says it special summons a monster face down. Extra deck monsters have the same rule because extra deck monsters can only be special summoned. Additionally, summons count as spell speed 1, so Cyber Dragon would only be able to special summon itself from your hand during your main phase, because this is the only phase where you can use spell speed 1 effects that have no other conditions. However, there is a card like Jirageto, which can special summon itself from your hand, but only during the battle phase. But because it comes out during the battle phase, it specifies that its special summon is a quick effect, which means spell speed 2, but on a monster. Every single trap card is technically spell speed 2 as well, but they don't call themselves quick effects because this is generally only denoted with monsters and spell cards that aren't typically spell speed 1. Technically, quick effect is a key term for spell speed 2, and that goes over pretty much everything you can do during your main phase. Now we can move on to the battle phase. You must declare that you're entering the battle phase in case your opponent wants to do anything before you change phases. If your opponent does perform some kind of quick effect, you're allowed to stay in the main phase instead of proceeding to the battle phase. But you have to state that you're entering the battle phase again when you decide to change phases. During the battle phase, all of your monsters who are in face-up attack position get one free attack that they can then use to attack either a monster or your opponent's life points directly. And this is the phase that basically determines who wins the game most of the time. Something like 90% of games are won during the battle phase, so it's a very important phase technically, but the real game is already won before the battle phase even begins in most cases. Attacking your opponent's life points directly just means you subtract the attack of your monster from your opponent's life points. So if you have a Cyber Dragon that attacks directly, for example, subtracting 2100 points from your opponent's 8000 life point total, their new life points will be 5900. Now, if your opponent has any monsters, you're not allowed to attack your opponent's life points directly. You can only attack directly if they have no monsters on their side of their field, or if you have a monster with an effect that says you can attack directly, which is pretty rare. In order to attack a monster, you select the monster that you wish to attack with, and then select its attack target on your opponent's side of the field. You can target any of your opponent's monsters, whether it be a face-up attack position or face-down defense position monster. This is called declaring an attack. Your opponent can't do anything in response unless they have some kind of quick effect, so you then proceed to damage calculation. If your monster has higher attack than your opponent's monster, then their monster is destroyed by that battle. Additionally, your opponent will take life point damage equal to the difference between your monster's attack and your opponent's monster's attack. So if your Cyber Dragon monster attacks a monster with 1000 attack, then your opponent takes 1100 points of damage to their life points. If you attack a defense position monster, then you apply your attack versus their defense points. If your attack is higher than their defense, the monster is destroyed. However, your opponent takes 0 points of damage to the life points because defense position monsters protect your life points from damage. This is why there's so many rules about summoning monsters in defense position, because having monsters in defense position is pretty valuable because it protects your life points. If the monster you're attacking was face down, you're not allowed to look at the monster until after you've committed to the attack. Once you've committed to the attack, the face-down monster is then flipped face-up, and then you get to determine the outcome of the battle, where if your attack is higher than their defense, the monster is destroyed. Now, what happens if your opponent's values are higher than yours? Say you
you're the one who loses life.
Attack than your monster. Well, then the opposite happens, and your monster is destroyed, and you take damage to your life points equal to the difference. Additionally, if you attack into a defense monster and their defense is higher than your attack, your monster is safe and not destroyed, but you still take life point damage. Which is another benefit to monsters in defense position, where not only does the controller of the defense position monster take no life point damage, but there's a chance they can deal life point damage to their opponent if their defense is high enough. Despite all the advantages of defense position monsters, you rarely summon monsters with high defense, ironically enough. Once one of your monsters attacks, you can then choose a new monster to attack. And if your opponent now has no monsters on their side of the field, you can choose
Since we're closed, I'll go ahead and open up some new packs and see if we get anything good.
Any order of monsters
and these are going to go by real fast.
They all attack individually by themselves. Whereas, for example, in Magic the Gathering, all your monsters have to attack at once.
Pulled a $428 card.
Attack per turn. So, because you get to choose each monster who attacks and what they attack,
I really got to get some card tables.
What order they attack in, the battle phase has a little bit of thought that goes into it, and how to properly dismantle your opponent's monsters with your lower attack monsters, so that your higher attack monsters can get in for direct damage in order to lower your opponent's life points more closer to 0. Then, after all of your monsters have attacked and the battle phase is over, you can proceed to the main phase 2, or skip straight to your end phase. Just a note, if you're the player going first, you cannot enter the battle phase, and you can only enter the main phase 2 if you've entered your battle phase. So
the very first pack gave us something really good, followed by a whole bunch of cheat cards.
Unusable during the very first turn of the duel, since it's impossible to enter the battle phase.
See if I can pull some more rares.
If you're going second, then you can use them during your first turn, just not the very first turn of the game. Because the
No.
person who goes first has such an overwhelming advantage, despite the fact they can't enter the battle phase, the person going second is allowed to draw a card on their first turn. So they start the duel with 6 cards in their opening hand instead of 5 like the person going first, who I might add does not draw a card on their first turn in
Come
case
on.
it wasn't specified. So, when you're leaving the battle phase, there's actually something called the end of battle phase step.
All
where
right.
some cards and effects only activate during this part of the battle phase, like
2 more
the
sets
gas,
that I
for
can open.
example, and you cannot go back into the battle phase after cards like these have resolved. You must then proceed to the main phase 2, which is a huge difference from the main phase, where you can keep doing the main phase after effects have been activated when you were about to leave. If you commit to leaving the battle phase and it's now the end phase of the battle phase, you cannot go back to the battle phase to do something if something else happens. This almost never comes up, but it is technically a specific ruling to the battle phase, where there is a start of the battle phase, the battle
Alright,
phase,
last
and then
date
the
of this
end
box.
the battle phase. Then, after your battle phase is done and your opponent has let you move on to the main phase 2, you can do everything you've done in the main phase 1 here as well. However, everything is shared between the 2 phases. So if you've already performed your 1 normal summon for the turn, you do not get an
Not
extra
bad.
normal summon. in the main
$53
phase
for
2.
this one.
But if you didn't use your normal summon yet, you are free to do your normal summon here at the main phase 2 instead. You can also activate cards and effects at spell speed 1, summon monsters that require spell speed 1 like Cyber Dragon, and whatever else you can do in the main phase 1, with the exception of changing the battle position of your monsters who have been summoned on a different turn if they've declared an attack. So if your
Like
entire
2
board
good
declared an
pulls out
attack
of
and
this
were
box.
summoned on your last turn, you cannot change your entire board to defense
Do I have
position
enough for a play
unless
table?
one of those monsters did not attack, in which case you can individually change
Oh,
the
it's just
ones that did
200.
not
Yeah,
attack
I
to
can
defense
afford that.
position if you wish. The main phase 2 is pretty important because one of the most valuable things you can do during the main phase 2 is place trap cards on the field and get ready for the next turn. Because there are actually a lot of effects that happen during the battle phase which might destroy your board, or get rid of other pieces on your board. Basically,
That's plenty of
your
space for
back
the
row with your
people to play,
spells and
right?
traps are not safe during the battle
And how much
phase.
does it cost for
So
some of
it's
the other...
best to just set them during the main phase 2.
Okay, I'm gonna wait
instead
on the
of main
boxes.
phase 1. And this
I gotta
is
sell some more
standard
packs and then I'll get
practice.
around
You
to
can generally tell someone is a new
buying
player if they set
boxes.
their trap cards during the main phase 1 instead of the main phase 2. Additionally, there are some cards and effects you can activate during the battle
That's
phase.
not
in order
bad.
to
We got a
protect your
profit of
monsters,
negative
like
821.
bodies
We're
and shield,
fine.
which you might want to have in your hand so that it's usable
I
during
mean,
the
not a
battle
bad
phase.
start.
But then you might want to set them during the main phase 2 so they're
Let's see,
usable during your
tournament.
opponent's turn. Because
nope,
you
not recruit.
can't activate
Event, here we
spell
go.
cards from your hand during your opponent's turn. So
Yeah,
if it's a
it's
quick play
$7 an
spell, which
hour,
is
cost
specifically
is
a spell
free,
speed
yep.
spell card, in order to use it during your opponent's turn, you have to set it on the field so that it's live during your opponent's turn. In which case, it basically has the rules of trap cards, where you
Now I have
can't
to
use
just
it until
wait
the next turn.
and let people come in.
Since My Body's a Shield protects monsters from getting destroyed in response to destruction effects, you can hold onto it in your hand during the battle phase just
I'll be
in
able to
case
buy
your opponent uses
some of
something
those
like Mirror
boxes
Force,
to fill
which
up
would
the space.
destroy all of your attack position monsters, in which case you can save them
Pass.
with your My Body as a Shield. But if they decide to not use a card effect like that, then you can set your My Body as a Shield to the main phase 2 to be used during your opponent's turn if they decide to destroy your monsters with something like Raigeki, which is a card which destroys all your monsters. So, quick play spell cards ideally are
Big
very
spender
powerful,
here,
which is why they
$54.
rarely print good effects on quick plays, because they don't want the card type
How much
to
would
be
it cost
that powerful.
by...
We'll go over the specific types of cards later on. After the main phase 2, you then
I could buy
proceed to
2.
the end phase, which normally is just a phase used in order to resolve a whole bunch of effects and abilities that only last until the end phase. However, there are some archetypes which have pretty much all of their triggers happen during the end phase, and then they perform their
Give
full
me 1
combo
second
during
here,
this
ma'am.
phase. But that's pretty rare, and for most duels, this just means the end of your turn, which is different from your end phase. The end of your turn happens after the end phase, which is a distinction
Thank
that
you.
matters for effects like Effect Veiler, which negates a monster's effects until the end of the turn.
Those boxes
and
are
not
nice.
The end phase. So if a monster has an effect that
I don't know
only
why, but
activates
things
in
like the
end
booster
phase,
boxes and
its
just
effect
like
is still negated until the end of the turn.
the
You
elite
can't
trainer
really
boxes
trigger
from
any
Pokemon,
cards or
those are
effects
nice.
during the end of the turn, which is why it's not called a phase. Then you pass over to your opponent, and as long as they're going second, they're allowed to draw a card and then proceed to all of their phases to play the game. Next, let's go over all
gonna
of
let
the
things
extra deck
roll
types of summons.
while I
Currently,
just
there are about
wait.
5 of them, and each one of them has different rules for how you go about them. First up, let's go over some general rules about the extra deck. The extra deck is a stack of 15 or less cards, which is separate from your normal main deck. The cards in the extra deck are available to use at any time that you meet the conditions to bring them out into the field.
Yeah, because it's
In which case, they act
fusion,
like any other main
synchro,
monsters.
XYZ
Whether they go
summons.
to the graveyard or if they're destroyed, they get banished if a monster banishes them. But if a card
Oh,
returns
and
them
Link.
to the hand,
Link
they
summon
instead
monsters.
get sent back to the extra deck. Or if a card will return it to the deck, they go back to your extra deck instead of the main deck. Also, a monster from the extra deck must be summoned properly before you can bring it back. What this means is, even if you use an effect like Cyberstein, which can cheat a fusion monster out of the extra deck, and then that fusion monster goes to the graveyard, you cannot use something like Monster Reborn to bring it back from the graveyard to the field, because it wasn't summoned properly first.
Nope.
However, if the card is summoned properly by its own conditions, then you can bring it back unless the card states otherwise, which most of them do not. So you can't do something like use extra Foolish Burial Goods in order to send a card from your extra deck to the graveyard in order to bring it out with a Monster Reborn, because you have to summon it to the field properly first before you can bring it back from the graveyard with something like Monster Reborn. Now let's go over each of the types of extra deck monsters. The first we have are fusion monsters. Fusion monsters are like cooking a recipe. Each fusion monster will list on the card itself the recipe necessary in order to
2 or
bring
more
it out.
monsters, as
Additionally,
well
you
as
need a
something like
fusion spell card in
polymerization.
order to bake the recipe that allows you to bring out the monster. So, for example, let's take a look at the Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon.
3 blue
This
eyes.
fusion monster requires 3 Blue Eyes White Dragons as its materials. The card doesn't also list anything else in its text, and that's because the rules of the
I wish
game
I could remember what
tell you
happened to
how
my
bring it
Blue
out.
Eyes Ultimate Dragon.
So, if you have 3
I don't think I
Blue
would
Eyes
have
White
traded it to
Dragons
someone,
and a
would
fusion
I?
spell card, you can use that fusion
Chances
spell
are I
card
probably lost
to then
it.
use those 3 Blue Eyes White Dragons in order to bring out the Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon from your extra deck to the field. The
I'll have to look
default
in, like,
fusion spell
TCG
card
Player
is
and see
called
if the card is,
Polymerization,
like,
which allows you
cheap.
to perform a fusion summon, which is just a fancy name for a special summon, but very specific in the fact that if you perform a fusion summon, that means it was summoned properly and can be brought back later. So, polymerization will allow you to perform a fusion summon, and in order to do so, you need to have the correct materials listed on that fusion monster in your hand or on the field. For a fusion summon, you're allowed to use monsters that are face down on the field. They do not need to be face up. So as long as you have 3 cards which have their name listed as Blue Eyes White Dragon, or even have their name changed to be Blue Eyes White Dragon, like maybe Elemental Hero Prisma, which has the effect to change its name to Blue Eyes White Dragon, you would then send those 3 cards with the current name Blue Eyes White Dragon from your hand or field to the graveyard. Then you would bring out the Blue Eyes
Yeah,
Ultimate
because I
Dragon
forget
from
that
your
there are
extra
some
deck
cards that
to
act
any of
as
the main
fusion
monster zones,
substitutes.
or to one of the 2 extra monster zones. Let's quickly go over what the extra monster zones are. These are 2 zones that are on the field, which can only ever have monsters from the extra
Those
deck
extra
summoned.
zones was something
And
I
I'm pretty
was
sure
not
it's
familiar
impossible to
with.
put a main deck monster into the extra monster zones under any circumstances. However, once you claim one of the 2 extra monster zones, you cannot use the other one. So you have to pick if you want the left or right one if it's available. And if it's not, then you have to pick the other one instead. A fusion monster can go into either the extra monster zone or any of the main monster zones. And this is a benefit of fusion monsters, because this is not the case for all the other extra deck monster types. Some of them can only go into the extra monster zone or to other zones based on other circumstances, which we'll talk about later. But generally, you don't want to waste the extra monster zone on a fusion monster. So you put it into one of your main monster zones. And there you have it.
That had to be something for like Synchro or
However,
Link.
This used a lot of materials
Or
to
even the
bring out a monster
XYZs.
with no effect. And generally, fusion monsters need to be ridiculously powerful in order to be worth bringing out. Like, for example, Guardian Chimera. This is a fusion monster whose requirements are any combination of 3 monsters from your hand or field. However, based on where the monsters are from, you then get an effect after it's summoned, where it can destroy a number of cards on the field equal to the amount of monsters on the field that you used, and also draw a number of cards equal to the number of monsters used from your hand. So, if you use 1 monster in the field and 2 cards in your hand, you get to draw 2 cards and destroy 1. Or if you use 2 monsters on the field and 1 in your hand, you get to destroy 2 cards and draw 1. It also has premium stats for how generic its materials are, and has a bonus protection, where if you specifically have polymerization in your graveyard, it cannot be targeted by card effects, which is really good protection. Guardian Chimera is worth
That is a pretty good fusion.
Polymerization because it gains immediate advantage and a good body on the field, whereas Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon isn't really worth being brought out with polymerization, because you get nothing but a big beat stick with no protection, and it requires incredibly specific materials, which Guardian Chimera does not. However, that's where the other kinds of fusion spell cards come in. Pretty much every archetype which goes into fusion monsters has its own specific spell card, and for Blue Eyes, they have Ultimate Fusion, which allows you to perform a fusion summon of a Blue Eyes fusion monster using materials from your hand, field, or graveyard, where you shuffle the materials into your deck instead of sending them to the graveyard, since you can't send cards in the graveyard back to the graveyard. And then you bring out the fusion monster, and then additionally, if you used any monsters from your field, you can destroy a number of face-up cards your opponent controls equal to the amount. So if you had 3 Blue Eyes White
Big
Dragons
spender
in the
here.
grave, you basically can shuffle them all back into your deck to bring out the Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon, which is way more worth it in terms of card advantage.
Oh god.
But because fusion monsters basically
Oh, dude's hoping for a rare.
out, they are generally either
184 bucks.
ridiculously weak or made
Nice.
ridiculously overpowered in order to overcompensate for the inherent downside. However, there is one other upside to fusion monsters that the other extra deck types
I just
do
remembered
not
I gotta pay my
have, and
bills.
that's the fact that sometimes fusion monsters can have alternative summoning conditions, which do not require a fusion spell card at all. But these alternative summoning conditions can sometimes be even better than what the other types of
I'm gonna
extra
pass on
monsters
Decor
allow.
just because it
For
costs a lot of
example,
money.
we have Thunder Dragon Colossus. This is an
I know it helped
incredibly
bring
powerful
some
fusion monster,
life
whose
into this
requirements
building,
are
but
Thunder Dragon plus any
maybe there's
Thunder
something
monster.
cheap I
However,
can.
it has an alternative summoning condition where you can instead
sign.
bring it out by simply tributing any Thunder effect
Or a
or
plant.
non-fusion monster you control during the turn that you activated a Thunder monster effect in your hand.
Yeah, why
So
not?
if you use something
Gonna
like
buy a
Nemesis
plant.
Corridor, which is a Thunder monster which activates in hand to special summon itself from your hand, that fulfills the entire condition of Thunder Dragon Colossus, and allows you to bring it out with 1 card from your hand. There's also some fusion monsters which have alternative summon conditions that can be paid from the graveyard. Like for example, ABC Dragon Buster has an alternative summon condition where you can banish its materials from your
$33?
field or graveyard to bring it out. And in fact, it says you do not use polymerization. And because it can bring itself out from only monsters in your grave, this makes it infinitely easier to bring out than pretty much
let me
every
buy some
other extra
boxes.
type of monster, because it just encourages you to get those cards into the graveyard as soon as possible to get a free powerful monster on the field. And because of how strong fusion monsters can be in this way, there were only like 3 other fusion monsters that can be brought out with this method. And nearly all of them have seen competitive play because of how powerful this is. So fusion monsters are
It is cool to
simultaneously
see
some of
that
the weakest extra
fusion
deck
monsters
types
are
and
still
some
being
of the
used in
most
tournaments and
potentially
such.
broken extra deck types, because they can basically have any kind of alternative summon condition printed on them they want, which can sometimes make them easier to be brought out than other types of extra deck monsters that we're going to go over later. Next up, let's go over Synchro Monsters. These are an extra deck
Yeah, I
type
think
with
it's
a
the
white
Synchro
card
Monsters
border,
where I
and
kind
they do
of
not need a special
stopped
spell
playing
card
the
to be
game
brought
for a
out.
while.
Instead, they need a special type of monster, which is a subtype called Tuner. When it comes to a monster and their types, pretty much
Oh
every
yeah, the
monster has
tuners,
one
I
type,
remember.
whether it be Spellcaster, Warrior, Beast, etc., etc. They almost never have additional types, unless it's a subtype, which is a largely legacy mechanic that's no longer used, except when it comes to tuners specifically. And all this means is that they have tuner listed next to their type. The card will not tell you what tuner means, and you just have to know the rules of how tuners work. So, in order to perform a synchro summon, just like a fusion monster, it will list what requirements are needed in order to bring it
Stinky.
out. And pretty much all of them will just say 1 tuner monster plus 1 or more non-tuner monsters. So, for example, say we have Gaia the Force of Earth. It needs 1 tuner plus 1 or more non-tuner monsters to be brought out. But what does this mean?
Now we can
When it
see.
comes to fusions, they give you way more
I will
specific
pass.
details on what materials are required. But synchro monsters just say tuners and non-tuners. Well, thankfully, it's pretty simple. All you have to do is add up the levels of the monsters. So, you need any tuner monster
Yeah, it
whose
works.
level
The leveling
the levels
works
of the
similarly to
non-tuner
like
monsters
rituals.
is equal to exactly the level of the synchro monster you want to bring out. So if you have a level 3 tuner monster and a level 3 non-tuner monster, you can perform a synchro summon with 2 of them to
It
bring
is
out
gold.
Gaia, since it's a level 6, and 3 plus 3 equals 6. But if you have a level 3 tuner monster and a level 4 non-tuner, you can't use them to bring out Gaia because their levels equal 7. You are not allowed to go over the number or under the number.
Oh yeah,
in
that's
any way.
a
It has to be
that's a
specific.
strict regulation compared to
But
like
you can
rituals.
use multiple monsters to hit this threshold. So if you have a level 3 tuner and a level 2 non-tuner plus a level 1 non-tuner, you can use those 3 monsters to go into Gaia because their levels equal 6 when added up. And just an extra side note, pretty much every monster in the game with a level is a non-tuner. The way to tell if a monster is a tuner or a non-tuner
It'll
is
just say
simply if
tuner.
it says tuner in its subtype. And if it doesn't, then it's a non-tuner. Fusion monsters can also be tuners and non-tuners because they technically have levels. So you can use a fusion monster as part of a synchro summon. In fact, there are some fusion monsters that are also tuners because they were designed specifically to go into synchro summons with. So synchro monsters are kind of difficult to use because you need to have a tuner, and there are only a limited amount of tuners in the game total. So technically, if there was only one tuner monster in the game, it would be required for every single synchro monster ever, because you can't perform a synchro summon without a tuner monster. And synchro monsters, because they're kind of hard to bring out, since they require specifically a different subtype of monster to even be used and exact math, are some of the strongest types of extra deck monsters in the game on average. If your deck is capable of playing a good tuner monster, you usually try to fit 1 or 2 in just so you have access to some of the most powerful synchro monsters. In fact, synchro monsters were so historically strong that they have the largest amount of them which were eroded to change their effects to be less powerful. There is no other card type which has had more erodas on them than synchro monsters to nerf them. Additionally, because tuner monsters are so valuable for synchros,
Okay, get
tuner
out.
monsters on a whole
Get out. Shoot.
generally have less
Shoot, shoot,
powerful
shoot.
effects than
Shoot.
regular monsters, because of their ability to be used for synchro monsters. So something like Glow Up Bulb, for example, which is a level 1 tuner monster that can special summon itself from the
Go ahead
graveyard,
and open up a
when
box
compared
here.
to something like Treeborn Frog, which is a level 1 regular monster that can special summon itself from the graveyard, Glow Up Bulb is so powerful it's been banned for years, and Treeborn Frog currently doesn't see any competitive play, despite the fact that Treeborn Frog brings itself out of the graveyard for free every turn, and Glow Up
Which
Bulb
is pretty
only
good.
brings itself out of the graveyard a single time, as its effect can only be used once per duel. And because of how tuners are necessary to
Ooh.
use synchros, a lot of decks don't use
Two
synchro
15s,
monsters at
nice.
all, unless they happen to have native tuner monsters in them already, and even then sometimes they don't play synchro monsters because they can't reliably get the numbers they need for the good synchro monsters, which are usually level 10s. If your deck can easily go into level 10 synchro monsters, you're probably gonna play synchros. But if you can only go into 9
$400
to 11s,
is what I need
you
for the
probably
card table
won't
right
because
here.
they're just not as valuable as the synchro monsters that have been printed at level 10. Just like fusion monsters, synchro monsters sometimes
Little bit of a
have
profit.
alternative summoning additions, but rarely do they include only using monsters from the graveyard, as currently there is only one single
New
synchro
day,
monster
let's
that
go.
does this, which is Blackwing Assault Dragon. Now let's go over Xyz monsters. Just so you know, these are pronounced
Xyz,
Xyz
that's
and
what it is.
not XYZ, because that's just how they said it in the anime, and that's how they wanted it to sound. So, the Xyz monster is the first
Yeah, I'm
monster
still
we're gonna
learning
go over
about
so far,
Xyz,
which
and I
does
have
not
no
have
idea.
levels. Instead, they have something called ranks, which look exactly like levels as their little black stars.
But I'm realizing they're
instead, and they
shifted
go
to
on
the
left-hand
left.
side of the card instead of the right-hand side. They
Yep.
also have a black border, so they're very easy to tell apart from all the other monster types. The way Xyz monsters work is a lot easier than synchros and fusion monsters, because despite the fact they don't have levels, they require monsters to have the same levels in order to bring them out. So, for example, if we look at Gemnite Pearl, it requires two
big spender.
level 4 monsters. What this means is if you have 2 level 4 monsters on your side of the field, you can take both of them and put them on top of each other, and then take the Xyz monster from your extra deck and place it on top of those 2 monsters into any of your main monster zones or the extra monster zone. And that's pretty much it. You don't need a special type of monster like a tuner. You can just use any 2 monsters in the game as long as they are both the exact same level. So, Xyz monsters heavily favor decks which use all the exact same level for their monsters. And the higher level the monsters, the stronger the Xyz monsters, with some of the strongest effects being tied to the level 8 bracket. Another neat distinction with Xyz monsters is how they activate their effects.
Okay, here we
Since
go.
The default method for
Card
bringing out an Xyz
table, we'll
monster
put that
gives
right
it monsters
here.
underneath it. Nearly all Xyz monsters use those monsters under them to activate their effects. Like, for
Sort
example,
these by
Castel the
price.
Skyblaster Musketeer. It has the effect where you detach one of its materials in order to target a face-up monster on the field and then change it to face-down defense position. This means when you bring out Castel with 2 level 4 monsters, it will have 2 materials underneath it, which will give you the ability to use its effect.
Now let's see if these
twice
guys will give me a
total
chance
before
to
it
set the
can
price
no
for these
longer
cards.
use the effect again, unless you find some way to give it more Xyz materials, which you rarely do. Additionally, it has another effect, where you can instead detach 2 of its materials in order to shuffle one other face-up card on the field back into the deck. Some Xyz monsters use the materials as
All right.
just limited protection, like how number 101 has the ability to detach one of its materials instead of getting destroyed. And since Xyz monsters are inherently
Right, that's
limited
something
by
I
the
kind of
finite
remember
amount of
about
materials, they can generally put really
Xyz.
powerful effects on Xyz monsters because they know they're going to be limited. Well, in theory, that's how it would work. But in
I
practice,
think the only
even
way I
the
know
Yu-Gi-Oh
about
designers knew this
Xyz
game
so
wouldn't
much
last
is
long
from
enough for it to
Legacy of the
matter.
Duelist.
So the effects are pretty in line with a lot of the other boss monster effects worth 2 monsters of materials. So the fact that you can't use your monster effects anymore after 2 turns usually doesn't matter because the game isn't designed for monsters to last that long anyway. Xyz monsters do have some other rules to them and general ways that they're used. Some Xyz monsters have the materials where you can use 2+ of any level for them, like in the case of Prime Meth Megalimbursion. This means you need to use at least 2 level 4 monsters, but you can use as many level 4 monsters as you control that you want, which is usually up to 5. Generally, you don't want to put 5 monsters under an Xyz monster because that will just prime it for being attacked or destroyed. So usually you want to use the least amount as possible, unless there's a really good reason to put more than that. In the case of Alimbursion, it gains more powerful effects based on the amount of materials it can detach. So in its case, it might be worth it just to get more than 2 monsters. And because it's really difficult to put 3 or more monsters into an Xyz monster, generally some of the strongest effects are tied to monsters that require at least 3 materials. There is also a thing called ranking up and ranking down, which technically isn't an official term, just a term used to describe common Xyz alternative summoning conditions. And one of the most common alternative summoning condition of an Xyz monster is to rank up on top of another Xyz monster. For example, number S39 Utopia Lightning is a rank 5 Xyz monster, which has the materials of 3 level 5 light monsters, which you almost never bring it out of this way because it has a much easier alternative summoning condition, where you can instead Xyz summon this card by just using a rank 4 Utopia monster you control on the field as its full material, and also transfer all of its Xyz materials to this card. So if you have number 39 Utopia on your side of the field with its full 2 materials, you can then just rank up Utopia Lightning on top of it, giving it 3 materials. However, you could even take this a step further. There's another card called number S39 Utopia Prime, which is a rank 4 monster that requires 3 level 4 light monsters to be brought out, which again, you never do because you instead use an alternative summon condition, where you can instead Xyz summon this card on top of specifically number 39 Utopia, where you then transfer all of its materials to this card, just like with Utopia Lightning. However, Utopia Prime specifically requires number 39 Utopia, whereas Utopia Lightning can just use any Utopia monster that's rank 4, which Utopia Prime is. So you can use Utopia Prime to go on top of the regular Utopia, giving it 3 materials. Then you can bring out Utopia Lightning on top of Utopia Prime, giving it 4 materials. And since Utopia Lightning requires you to detach 2 materials to use its effect, this is generally how you want to bring it out, so you can use its effect at least twice. And that's the basics of alternative summon conditions when it comes to Xyz monsters. Nearly all of them work exactly like this, where they just rank up on top of other monsters that meet its alternative summon condition, and then gain all the materials of the Xyz monsters underneath it. Sometimes the alternative summon condition is just a regular non-Xyz monster, but a vast majority of the time it's another Xyz monster they rank up on top of. And in fact, there are sometimes even spell cards called rank up spell cards, which allow you to do this with just other types of monsters that don't have alternative summon conditions. And it's because of these spell cards that we get the name of rank up, even though it's not technically called rank up, it's just called an Xyz monster's alternative summon condition. Now, before we move on from Xyz monsters, we should probably note that because Xyz monsters technically do not have levels, they are straight up immune to cards which affect monsters with levels. For example, something like Gravity Bind, which makes it so all level 4 or higher monsters cannot attack. Xyz monsters are just immune to this card because they don't have levels. Also, Xyz monsters can't be used for synchro summons because they don't have levels, and synchro monsters require monsters with levels to be brought out. Additionally, when monsters are detached from Xyz materials to the graveyard to activate effects, they are not treated as being sent from the field to the graveyard. So, for example, a card like Sandman, which activates its effect when it's sent from the field to the graveyard, does not trigger because cards under an Xyz monster are not counted as being on the field. They're counted as being under the Xyz monster who is on the field. but technically they exist in a subspace which ignores a lot of rules. Because also, if a
Weird.
card is
I
detached
did
from
not
the
know
Xyz
that.
material as a cost, it will go to the graveyard, even if a floodgate is in place, which banishes all monsters that would go to the grave, unless it's detached as an effect, which is a difference we'll go over when we talk about colons and semicolons, some of the most important distinctions on card effects. Now let's go over pendulum monsters.
Oh
These are
god,
technically
pendulum.
main deck monsters, but they have special rules that if they're destroyed on the field or would be sent from the field to the graveyard in some way, they instead go to the extra deck face up. So they're like half main deck monsters, half extra deck monsters.
Yeah, I still have no idea how
Additionally,
pendulums
pendulum
work.
monsters themselves are half spells and half monsters, which means they have two different effects depending on which one you're going to be playing it as. You can either set it to the left or rightmost spell and trap card zone as a continuous spell card, or you can summon it like a normal monster to the field. Each pendulum monster has a scale from 0 to 13, and this is necessary for something
0 to
called a pendulum
13.
summon, which interacts with levels. So, if you have a monster with a pendulum scale of 3 and a monster with a pendulum scale of 5, then you can do something called a pendulum summon, which allows you to special summon any number of monsters from your hand or that are face up in your extra deck to your monster zones that have levels between those scales. So, in the case of 3
Okay.
and 5, you can only bring out level 4 monsters. Or if your scales were 0 and 13, you can bring out levels 1 to 12 monsters, which is all
Oh,
of the types of monsters
that's why
in the
it
game,
goes from
basically.
0 to
And there are
13.
absolutely scales of 0
Gotcha.
and 13, so this is technically possible. Generally, scales don't go above 8 without some kind of limitation though. And all pendulum monsters have the numbers on both sides of the scales, so it doesn't matter if they're the left or right side, just as long as they're two different numbers with at least one level in between them, so you can actually bring out cards between their numbers.
Okay.
So, if, for example, you have a pendulum scale of 4 and 5, you can't pendulum summon any monsters because there's no monsters between levels 4 and 5. Also,
Makes
there are
sense.
technically rules in place for a monster to have a different scale on its left and right side. It's just currently in the game, every single pendulum monster has the exact same numbers on both sides, and there isn't really a way to change it at the current moment. But in the future, they might introduce mechanics which change the pendulum scales on the left and right, so currently that's just not the case. Now, how do you get a pendulum summon? Well, it's actually a basic game mechanic that is unlocked once you have your scales, and it works exactly like a normal summon, where you just get one pendulum summon for free every turn, but only one. And you can only use it as spell speed 1 and only during your main phases. There are cards which allow you to perform additional pendulum summons, but those are very rare and generally are not played and will also tell you in the card text that it does so. So if you're playing a pendulum deck, you generally play around that one pendulum summon you get per turn. Additionally, there are some extra rules for pendulum monsters specifically, which are brought out with pendulum summoning. If a pendulum monster is pendulum summoned from your hand, it can go into any of the main monster zones. However, you can bring out as many of them from your hand as you have zones available, and as long as their levels and restrictions allow them to be summoned from the hand, i.e. having a level in between the pendulum scales. However, if your pendulum monsters face up in the extra deck, you can only bring out your pendulum monster with your pendulum summon to the extra monster zone, or to a zone that a link monster is pointing to in your main monster zones. So, if you don't play any link monsters, you can basically only bring out one of your pendulum monsters that's face up in your extra deck. And just a reminder, a pendulum monster only goes face up in your extra deck if it would be sent to the graveyard from face up on the field. So
Gotcha.
if you use a pendulum monster for a fusion summon, synchro summon as a tribute, or if it gets destroyed, it will go face up into your extra deck instead of the graveyard, as long as it was on the field. But if a pendulum monster is detached as an Xyz material, it goes to the graveyard like normal, because Xyz materials are not counted as being on the field. Also, if a pendulum monster gets banished, it just gets banished like normal, which means removed from the game. Or if it gets returned to the deck, it just gets returned to the deck. And if it gets bounced, it goes back to the hand, just like any normal monster would. Additionally, if there's an effect in place which sends all monsters on the field somewhere else, like Shen Shen for example, which banishes all cards on the field which would be sent to the graveyard, it also applies to pendulum monsters, because they need to have the ability to be sent from the field to the graveyard in order to go face up in the extra deck. If they're banished instead of going to the graveyard, then they are also banished instead of going to the extra deck face up. Now, because pendulum monsters go to the extra deck and can be used again on your next turn, there's a lot of restrictions on pendulum monsters which are also tuners. because this would mean you can
Oh
bring the tuner
god.
back every turn to go into synchro summons on every turn for a lot easier than any other kinds of tuners. Which is why more than half of the pendulum tuner monsters have effects where they just kind of banish themselves after being brought out a single time from the extra deck. Now let's go over link monsters, the final extra deck method. Link monsters, theoretically, are the easiest types of extra deck monsters to go into because they don't require levels, tuners, scales, or fusion spell cards.
Go
They just
on.
require number of monsters on the field. Like, for example, Beat Cop from the Underworld can be link summoned with any 2 monsters. This means they can be any level, any types of monsters, and even tokens. And the
Oh.
fact that link monsters don't care about the specifics of the monsters being used, this ridiculously opened up the viability of tokens when they were released. Because link monsters care more about getting a whole bunch of cards on the field than they do about the quality of the cards that are on the field.
Oh, that
every
makes it
other
easy.
extra deck method prior. So they also have a lot of restrictions to them. Link monsters can only be summoned to the extra monster zone, so they don't get a choice to pick the other zones like fusions, synchros, or Xyz monsters do. Basically, link monsters and pendulums are the only ones who are restricted to the extra monster zone when brought out from the extra deck. Additionally, link monsters have arrows on them which point to very specific zones on the field. And by default, all link monsters can be summoned to a zone.
Yeah,
that
what do
only
those
belongs to
arrows
level
mean?
2 instead of the extra monster zone. Same goes for pendulum monsters. So technically, if you have link arrows on all 5 of your main monster zones, you can pendulum summon 5 pendulum monsters from your extra deck to your main monster zones, although setting that up is very difficult. There is also additional mechanics that come up based on how link monsters are pointing to things. If a link monster is pointing at another monster, then it's considered linked with that monster. Gameplay-wise, this means absolutely nothing. But there are some cards and effects which only interact with linked monsters. And sometimes link monsters will grant effects to monsters they are linked with. If 2 link monsters are pointing at each other, meaning their arrows are touching, this is called a co-link. And since it's really difficult to co-link, generally there's really good effects tied to this mechanic. Although it is very rare and almost never comes up, because there's only 23 cards in the game total that even mention co-link as a mechanic. Next, there's something called the extra link. This is when monsters are co-linked from one extra monster zone all the way through the monster zones and then ending on the other extra monster zone.
Oh god.
Normally, you can only use one of the extra monster zones, except if an extra link is possible. But since it usually takes up 4 link monsters in order to set up an extra link, this is something you will rarely see. But it did used to happen pretty often when link monsters were first released, and there were a lot of really broken link monsters that existed that allowed this to happen, which are all pretty much banned now. And because of this extra link mechanic, that means there is absolutely 0 link to monsters in the game with upwards pointing diagonal arrows. Because this would allow you to extra link with only 3 cards. One from the extra monster zone pointing diagonally to the middle main monster zone, and then having that middle monster zone pointing diagonally up to the other extra monster zone. So the 2 upward diagonal pointing arrows is basically like the forbidden link placement, and it's unlikely they'll ever print one in the game. In fact, there are some Link 3 monsters which have these 2 forbidden arrow placements, but all of them without exception have an effect which prevents you from using those zones to summon monsters to, specifically to prevent a 3-card extra link. You have to go all the way to a Link 5 monster before you finally get one with these 2 forbidden link arrows where it doesn't have restrictions. And because you need at least 5 monsters to go into a Link 5, it's not that big of a deal if you use a 3-monster extra link in this way, because of how hard it is to get to a Link 5 monster in the first place. And finally, there's link climbing. So basically, link monsters will sometimes have a requirement on them that says it requires 2+ monsters as their materials. This is because the amount of monsters necessary for its link summon is equal to its link rating, and its link rating will be tied to how many link arrows it has. So, for example, Gaia Saber is a Link 3 monster that requires 2+ monsters as its materials. This means you need to use 3 monsters in order to bring it out. However, it says 2+, which means you could potentially bring it out with less than 3 monsters. And the way to do this is with other Link monsters and their Link ratings. So, a Link 2 monster will count as 2 materials towards a Link monster summon. So, if you have a Beat Cop of the Underworld out already, and you have one other just regular monster, Then you can use the link to Beat Cop as 2 materials towards the link summon, and then the one monster as the other one in order to fulfill the rest of the requirement. However, if the link monster goes over the amount, then you can only use it as 1 material like normal. So if you want to bring out Gaia Saber and you have a Traffic Ghost out, which is a link 3 monster, you can't use it as the full material because it's already 3 links worth. So it would only count as 1 monster, and you would still need 2 others, or 1 other link 2 monster. I know it sounds a little confusing, but basically,
Yeah, just a little.
you can only link climb with monsters with link ratings lower than the monster you're trying to bring out. So if you want to bring out a link 5, for example, you could do that with a link 3 and a link 2 monster as its full materials, assuming it allowed you to do that. Technically, a high-level link monster can just say 1+ materials, and you could use a monster with the same link rating to bring out another monster with the exact same link rating. And there are some monsters in the game that do that. And there's some spells that allow you to do that as well. One of the only ones that can do that on your own link 4 monster is called World Sea Dragon Zealantis, which is unique in that it requires 1+ effect monsters as its materials, which means if you have a link 4 monster on board, you can use it as its full material since it doesn't require 2+, like pretty much every other link monster in the game. Although this is extremely rare, and you can think of Zealantis as an exception rather than the rule. So that's basically how link monsters work. They're restricted to the extra monster zone or zones that other link monsters are pointing to. So if you want to bring out a whole bunch of link monsters, you have to make sure the first one you bring out has a downward pointing arrow in some way, so that you can continue to your main monster zones.
Right.
So playing with a whole bunch of link monsters really requires you to keep your zone placement very strict and serious. And the placement of your zones matters a lot when it comes to link monsters, which is why you have to track which zones your monsters are in so heavily in Yu-Gi-Oh!, where it's not that big of a deal in other card games. But because link monsters are so generous in what types of cards you can use to bring them out, you'll see them most commonly out of all other extra deck types. And they usually have the simplest and least powerful effects out of all the extra deck types, simply because they're just so much easier to bring out. Now that we know the basics of how to play and the basics of the extra deck monsters, let's go over the actual game mat. We talked about this a lot so far, and it's pretty intuitive how it works. You have 5 main monster zones and 5 spell and trap card zones. The left and rightmost spell and trap card zones are also the pendulum zones, and you can place your pendulum monsters as pendulums into these zones. So if you block them with your other spells and traps, then you can't use them. There's also a field zone, which you can only place a field spell card into, which is just a different type of spell card. The extra monster zone, which we just explained pretty heavily with link monsters.
For the extra deck monsters.
Deck, which we also just explained. And then the main deck and the graveyard. The graveyard is just where everything goes after it's been used. If the monster is destroyed, it goes to the graveyard. If something is discarded from your hand, it goes to the graveyard, etc., etc. And finally, there's banishment, which is what happens if a monster is
removed from play.
This is generally the better way to get rid of a card on the field, because if it's banished, it is much harder to interact with or get any benefits from it. Because there are a lot of cards in the game which have effects that activate from the graveyard, whereas there are infinitely less cards that activate when banished, but there are some as well. Now let's go over monster cards. If a monster card has an effect, it will say that it's an effect monster next to its type. If it's a tuner, it will say that next to these two, since that's its subtype. Most cards do not have a subtype though. They only have one type, and then detail if it's an effect monster or some kind of extra deck monster, where a link monster will say that it's a link monster next to its type, and that if it's an effect monster, same with fusion, synchros, Xyz, or pendulums.
So on and so forth.
In the top right-hand corner, we have the attribute. There are only 6 attributes in the game, plus a 7th special attribute that is only used by one archetype of monsters.
For the
Attributes
gods.
only really matter if a card says it interacts with it. Otherwise, they don't really have any gameplay mechanics, like in Pokemon where you can deal extra damage versus other people's different types of attributes. Same with cards' monster types. It gives them no other special gameplay benefits, and is only there to be distinguished by other cards and their effects. At the bottom is the monster's attack and defense. Attack points are only applied while in attack mode and defense for only defense mode, unless they have an effect which interacts with them in different ways. When it comes to the attack of a monster, it's generally determined by its level. There's no hard-cut rule on how much attack points a monster can have for its level, and more of just something that Konami just generally designs towards. Monsters that are level 4 or lower generally have under 2000 attack. Monsters that are level 5 and 6 generally have 2000 to 2500 attack, and monsters that are level 7 and higher generally have under 3000 attack but more than 2500. Additionally, the number values get even weirder when they get into the specifics of the level 4 lower monsters. Because level 4 lower monsters can be summoned without tributes from your hand, they've kind of leaned into a design space of having specific values that they don't like to go over. Level 4
Right.
monsters do not go over 2000 attack without some kind of negative side effect, which means 1900 attack is the maximum attack a level 4 effect monster can have before it starts gaining detriments. For level 3 monsters, this threshold is 1700 attack, which means a level 3 monster won't go above 1600 attack before it starts gaining a detriment. For level 2 monsters, this threshold is 1400 attack. So 1300 and below is what they generally go into before gaining detriments, and in fact, the vast majority of level 2 monsters have 1000 or less attack. And for level 1 monsters, the threshold is only 500. But this one's a little bit more loose. Generally, level 1 monsters are at around or under 500 attack points, and they rarely go above it, even if they don't really gain any detriments for going above it. Extra deck monsters, they kind of go in similar territories with their attack point values based on levels of monsters used for their summon. For level 4 single monsters, because they require at least 2 monsters of materials to go into them, they generally go above the 2000 threshold without downsides, but not by much. For level 3 single monsters, they kind of follow the same thresholds. Same with the level 2s and 1s. For level 5 single monsters, they still follow the theme of not going above 2500, but there was an exception for level 6 single monsters, where one of them was at 2800 attack for its attack, and was considered too overpowered at this attack threshold that it was banned for a long time, and then was given a change to summon requirement to make it harder to bring out, to justify having an attack stat that was over 2500 for a level 6 monster.
Yeah.
And funny enough, level 7 single monsters don't go up to 3000 attack. It's not until you hit the level 8 and higher single monsters that they get to the 3000 attack threshold. Currently, there is only one level 7 single monster with 3000 attack, and it's a relatively newer single monster. When it comes to Xyz monsters and their attacks, they kind of follow the same values as single monsters. Rank 4 monsters, ironically, are locked at 2600 attack and below, and rarely go above 2600 without some kind of detriment. Like Crazy Box, for example, which has 3000 attack for a rank 4 monster, with only generic requirements, meaning any 2 level 4 monsters without restrictions. And it has a baseline ability where it just cannot attack, to make up for having more than 2600 attack. Anyways, enough about attack power values, let's go over spells and traps. There are 6 different types of spell cards. Normal spell cards are all spell speed 1 and can only be activated from your hand during your main phase. Because they're so slow and restrictive, they usually have some of the most powerful effects. Equip
for
spells
sure.
are a type of spell card that can only be equipped to a monster in order to exist on the field. One of the most common types of equip spells are ones that are equipped to your monsters to increase their stats. Equip cards will go to the graveyard if the monster they're equipped to is also destroyed, or if the equipped monster is flipped face down, or leaves the field temporarily. Because equip cards can be destroyed so easily, as they are vulnerable to both back row and monster destruction, they're generally some of the weakest types of cards in the game. But
unfortunately,
because they're so inherently weak, they sometimes print incredibly powerful effects on them to see if they can get away with it. Because you can equip an equip spell card to a monster from the graveyard to bring it out, which has historically been very good. And you can equip your opponent's monsters with equip cards, which can sometimes be used in order to take control of your opponent's monsters.
and
which
it's
has
fun.
historically also been very good as well. However, outside of equip cards that steal your opponent's monsters, or equip ones to the graveyard to bring them out, they're generally not very good for normal decks that don't revolve around specifically equip cards.
Fair.
Field spells are a type of spell card that can only be placed into the field zone, and you can only control one field at a time. But if you want
I
to
like that he's
activate a
using
new
the Seal
field
of
spell, you can
Orichalcos
just
as
put
the
it on top of
example.
your old one, which will send your old one to the graveyard, which is something you
I
can't
gotta get a
do for
copy
your
of that
other
card at
types of
some
spells and
point.
traps. Your opponent can also have a field spell, in which case both yours and your opponent's will exist on the field at the same time. Although this did not used to be the case,
Oh,
they
yep.
changed the rules to allow both players to have their own field spell out at the same time.
Yeah, it used to be
when
that
they
there could
decided
only
to
be
make
one field spell
better.
at a
Field
time.
spells affect the entire field, meaning sometimes they have effects that you and your opponent are allowed to use. Although most modern field spells only work one-sided, and only allow their controller to use its effects. Quick play spell cards are basically like trap cards. You're able to set them and use them during your opponent's turn whenever you want, and you can also use them from your hand during any of your phases instead of just the main phases. Because
Mm-hmm.
they're so fast, generally they have much weaker effects on them in order to compensate. Like for example, you'll never see a quick play spell which can destroy all of your opponent's monsters.
Oh
But you
no,
will
that'd
see
be
a
too
lot of
powerful.
normal spell cards which do that because it's a lot slower and easier to play around. Ritual spell cards are a type of spell card that can only be used to bring out ritual monsters.
Yeah, the ritual
These are main deck
spells.
monsters with blue backgrounds, not to be confused with the blue background of the Link monsters, which require you to use a ritual spell card in order to bring them out from your hand by fulfilling the conditions on that ritual spell card, which is usually to tribute monsters from your hand or field whose total levels equal or exceed the level of the ritual monster. Because this whole mechanic is so clunky, modern ritual spell cards have incredibly powerful effects tied to them, and sometimes allow you to ritual summon monsters from the graveyard or even your deck as well. Continuous spell cards are a type of spell card that exist permanently on the field, similar to
Yeah.
field spell cards, except you can have multiple continuous spell cards out, whereas you can only have a single field spell. Continuous spells basically have effects similar to field spells, where they affect all of your monsters or your other cards in some way, or have some way to generate advantage every turn. Like Supply Squad, which allows you to draw a card every time one of your cards is destroyed. One little niche with field spells and continuous spells that you should be aware of is that when you activate a field or continuous spell from your hand, there's a window of opportunity where your opponent can destroy the card before it fully resolves. And if
Yep.
they do destroy it in this way, its effect will never apply, since they need to stay on the field in order for their effects to resolve. So, if you use a card like Mystical Space Typhoon in response to the activation of a field spell which would search a card on its activation, it will actually stop the search from going through. But if you use Mystical Space Typhoon on something like a normal spell card that's trying to search, it will not stop the effect because normal spells do not need to be on the field to resolve their effects, since they're
Yes.
set to be destroyed
Oh.
anyway. Additionally, monsters work
Ooh.
differently as well. Even though monsters
105.
are also permanent cards that stay on the field, if you destroy a monster with its on-summon trigger effect, the effect will still resolve because monsters specifically do not need to be on the field to resolve their effects. This rule only applies to spell and trap card permanents like field and continuous spell and trap cards. Now let's go over trap cards. For traps, there's only 3 different distinctions for them. You have normal traps, which can be activated at any point whenever you want, as long as the conditions for its activation requirement are met. If it doesn't have an activation requirement, then you can just use it whenever you want, just as long as it's not the turn it was set face down. A continuous trap is the exact same way. You can just use it whenever you want and chain into anything you want, just as long as you have the activation requirements met. If it doesn't have an activation requirement, you can just use it whenever you want as long as it's not the first turn that it was set face down. They also follow the same rules as continuous spells and field spells, where if it's destroyed before it resolves the effect, then it will not resolve. And finally, we have the counter trap cards, which is the first unique type of card amongst all of them. These cards are spell speed 3, and every single counter trap has a trigger for when you can activate them, as in they will only ever react in response to something else. You will never see a counter trap card as a Chain Link 1, for example. Most counter trap cards have the effect to stop other cards, so their power is relatively strong. But most modern combo decks are able to do this without the need of counter trap cards, so you don't see them too often around. But it's not a completely dead mechanic either. So think of counter traps as like interrupts. They only exist to interrupt your opponent in some way and do a very good job at it. Another little difference between spells and traps is that if you set a spell card face down, you could use it immediately the turn you set it, but you still can't use it if it's on your opponent's turn, unless it's a quick play spell, in which case as soon as you set it, it follows the rules of a trap card, where
Which is
you
cool.
can no longer activate it that turn, and you have to wait until the next turn to use it. And there are some trap cards that allow you to use their effects from your hand directly, but they all specifically print in their card text the conditions required in order to do that, like how Infinite Impermanence requires you to control no cards in order to activate it from your hand. Now, let's explain how chains work. Chains are how you resolve a whole bunch of effects happening at once. If someone activates a card effect, then your opponent has a chance to activate their own effect in response to it, but only if it's spell speed 2 or higher. And then you simply resolve the effect backwards. So whatever was activated first will resolve last in the chain. Say for example, you activate Pot of Desires from your hand, you will immediately pay the cost to banish the top 10 cards of your deck, and then your opponent gets a chance to respond. Say they respond with an Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring, which is a monster that has an effect which can activate from the hand in order to negate the effect of a card which would draw cards. That would be Chain Link 2. Then it goes back to you, and you can choose to add something else to the chain if you want, where you can then
And you
choose
can
to
just keep
activate
building
something
that
like
chain
Called
up.
by the Grave, which targets your opponent's Ash Blossom in the graveyard, and if it resolves, will negate its effects for the rest of the turn. And then, if your opponent has nothing else to add to this, the chain will resolve backwards. So, your Called by the Grave will resolve, banishing their Ash from the graveyard, and then negating all cards with its name for the rest of the turn. Then, Ash Blossom's effect will try to resolve. However, it's currently being negated, and the effect won't happen. And then finally, Pot of Desires will resolve and draw you 2 cards. However, if we go back to this example, and you activate Pot of Desires and then pass priority to your opponent, and they activate a counter trap card like Magic Jammer, for example, which allows them to discard 1 card from their hand to negate the effect of a spell card, then priority would pass back to you. And unless you had another counter trap card of your own, this is the end of the chain, because you can't chain anything else to a counter trap card except other counter trap cards, which
Right.
means you're basically chain blocked. And even if you had something which could stop a trap card in your hand, you can't use it unless it was a counter trap card. So the chain would resolve backwards, Magic Jammer would resolve and negate the effect of the spell card it was directly activated in front of, which would stop Pot of Desires from drawing you 2 cards. What happens if multiple cards activate at once though? Say for example you pendulum summon cards that both trigger on being summoned, like Elemental Hero Stratos and Selectrice of Almonica. Both of these cards have effects that allow you to optionally search a card from your deck on their summon. However, in this case, you really want the effect of Stratos to go through without being interrupted. So you get to choose the order of the chain since both of the triggers happened at the exact same time. And if you want to protect Stratos, you can do something that's an advanced move called chain blocking, where you simply choose to activate Stratos first, then you choose to activate Selectite right afterwards, because you get to activate both of these effects back to back before your opponent gets a chance to respond. They only have the option to negate the effect of Selectrice with the Ash Blossom in their hand if they had one, instead of being able to use it on Stratos, because most negates only work on cards that have activated last in the chain. So chain blocking is a very common strategy for high level play, and you will see this constantly. What's funny is that in Magic the Gathering, chain blocking isn't possible because you are allowed to target chains within the stack. So if this was Magic, your opponent would just be able to target Stratos' effect with an Ash Blossom, even though it was activated first, it is no longer at the end of the chain. However, in Yu-Gi-Oh! It doesn't work this way, so Stratos' effect is safe to search a hero from your deck. Now, let's go over priority. Priority is something that's very important when it comes to chains, because it determines how you're able to
I can get more
chain things
rare
to
card
each other.
packs.
For my past example, I kept saying you would pass your priority to your opponent in order to see if they wanted to respond. And this is basically what priority is. Who's allowed to do what during the turn. However, sometimes it's a little bit more complicated than just asking your opponent if they have a response. Like, for example, if your opponent has a quick effect that can only be activated during a specific phase, they have to wait for priority in order to be able to use it. So, for example, if they have something like Sprite Elf, which has a quick effect to special summon a level 2 monster from your graveyard, but only during the main phase. They can't use it as soon as your main phase starts, because you have priority to do whatever you want on your turn before your opponent gets a chance to activate quick effects. So, if you wanted to try to get rid of Sprite Elf before it's able to use its effect, this is the only opportunity you have to do so. Just as long as the thing you do doesn't start a chain though, because they absolutely can just chain the effect to whatever you do. So, the only surefire way to get rid of something like this without starting a chain would be use a card like a Kaiju, which can special summon to your opponent's side of the field by tributing one of your opponent's monsters, and does not start a chain. So allows you to get rid of that pesky Sprite Elf without your opponent getting an opportunity to ever use its effect, even though they made it to the main phase where it would normally be able to. There are actually a lot of other things which can pass priority to your opponent that do not involve activating an effect though. Outside of activating effects, you pass priority to your opponent if you summon a monster, set a monster from your hand, change the battle position of a monster, set any spell or traps, or try to change the phase. So if you just try to enter the battle phase without doing anything in your main phase, this will pass priority to your opponent and then they can use their effects. And this seems like kind of a complicated ruling, but it's actually done on purpose, because giving monsters a quick effect that is restricted to a phase is a nerf done specifically to lower the power level of that card, because generally this is tied to very powerful cards and effects, which would otherwise be even stronger without this restriction. Now let's go over
Huh.
some battle phase rules. The battle phase is split into 3 parts. There's the start step of the battle phase, which only exists because some cards and effects can only be activated here. Then
Right.
there's the battle step, which is where most of the battle phase takes place. And then there's the end step, which again basically exists for card effects that only activate here. However, you're not allowed to go back to the battle step after declaring end step, so it's a little bit more restrictive. During the battle step, you're able to select any one of your monsters in attack mode in order to declare an attack with it, where you either target one of your opponent's monsters for the attack, or you can attack your opponent's life points directly, which reduces their life points by the attack of your monster, and this is the most common way you win a duel. However, if you declare an attack on one of your opponent's monsters and the monster somehow disappears for some reason, either because it's sent to the graveyard or was destroyed by some kind of card effect, as long as you haven't entered the damage step yet,
Then you can attack
redeclare the
directly.
attack, which is called a replay. Now, there are some specific rules when it comes to a replay, because there are actually a lot of cards and effects that trigger on an attack declaration, like Mirror Force, for example.
Oh,
So if you
yeah.
target a monster with an attack and for some reason didn't use Mirror Force, and that monster disappears from the field before you get a chance to go into the damage step, you get to redeclare the attack on a different monster. However, you cannot activate Mirror Force in response to this redeclare because technically they didn't declare an attack. They're performing something that's called a replay by game mechanics. Generally, this comes up pretty often with the card Link Kuriboh, which has the ability where it contributes itself in order to lower the attack of a monster which is declared an attack, and also has a quick effect to special summon itself from the graveyard by tributing a level 1 monster. So, if you declare an attack on a level 1 monster, and your opponent responds to this by using Link Kuriboh's ability in the grave to tribute that monster, this will then cause a redeclare. And if they then target Link Kuriboh, it would not be able to use its other ability to tribute itself to lower the attack of the monster to 0, because it only triggers on a declare and not a replay. Then, if your attack successfully goes through, you enter the damage step, which is comprised of 5 different steps. First up, we have the start of the damage step. This means you are officially in the damage step, which is a distinction that actually matters, because you can't activate spell speed 2 effects during the damage step. Normally, you can
really?
activate spell speed 2 effects whenever you want, except in response to a counter trap card. However, the damage step is one of those very few exceptions. So if you want to destroy a monster that is normally kind of tricky to pin down, getting it to the damage step is one of the safest feelings you can have, because they're probably going to get destroyed because you can't really do anything at this point. However, you can still use counter trap cards during the damage step with no problem. And there's also some spell speed 2 effects that can be activated during the damage step, but it's very specific in what can and can't be used. And this basically includes all cards and effects which modify attack and defense, but they have to modify attack and defense directly. They can't modify attack and defense indirectly. So a card like Reverse Trap, for example, which has the ability to reverse the attack and defense gains of cards and effects which grant attack or defense or subtractions, can't be used during the damage step because it technically doesn't directly modify attack and defense, and instead modifies the effects of cards which modify attack and defense. Also, you can use spell speed 2 effects during the damage step, which specifically negate the activation of a card, but not a card which negates the effect of a card. So, to put it in simpler terms, when a card is activated, its effect is comprised into 2 different categories: the activation and the effect. If a card has the effect where it can only be activated once per turn, and a card negates the activation of the card with, say, like Solemn Judgment, then if you have another copy of that card in your hand, you can just use it because its activation was negated. But if a card negates the effect of a card and not the activation, like an Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring, you would not be able to use a second copy in your hand because you technically activated the card. Its effect just kind of didn't work. So this distinction matters for the damage step, because only cards which negate the activation of cards specifically can be used here, but not cards that negate the effects of cards. So you can use Ghost Spell and Haunted Mansion because it negates the activation of cards that target cards in the graveyard, but not Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring because it only negates the effects of cards that move cards out of the deck. Now, back to the damage step. At the start of the damage step, this is basically where you activate the effects of cards that activate at the start of damage step, like Cataster. which destroys a monster that it battles, which is not a dark attribute monster. And because that monster was destroyed by this effect, that immediately ends the damage step. But you cannot declare another attack because you cannot cause a redeclare during the damage step. If the attack makes it to the damage step, then it's no longer possible to cause a redeclare, which is to prevent cards like Cataster from just blowing up your opponent's entire board by crashing through everything. It is basically a limitation put in specifically for cards like Cataster, but this can also be used to your advantage. There's a card called World Legacy Clash, which allows you to banish one of your cards until the end phase and then lowers the attack and defense of one of your opponent's monsters by the attack of the monster banished. Since part of this card's effect modifies attack and defense directly, you can use it during the damage step. And on your monster that's being attacked, you can actually cause the battle to just fizzle out, and the monster it was attacking will not be allowed to redeclare, and basically had its attack blocked for that turn. Now, after the start of the damage step, we have before damage calculation. This is basically where you flip face down monsters face up and card effects that activate before damage calculation. If a monster has a flip effect, it's not activated yet and won't apply
until
its
after
effect
the
until
damage step.
Fourth part of the damage step. Now we go over the perform damage calculation, the third part of the damage step. This is where a lot of attacking cards can be activated, like Honest or Injection Fairy Lily. Whoever is declaring the attack has priority on these moves, and there's a hidden rule that says monsters with these kinds of effects can only activate their effects once during this step, so they don't need to specify that you can only use the effects once per turn or once per damage step. So, if you're attacking with Injection Fairy Lily, which allows you to pay 3,000 life points to gain 2,000 attack, you can only use it a single time because of game rules, even though it doesn't say once per turn on it. If you're attacking with a light monster and your opponent has a light monster, and you both have Honest in hand, this is where you'd be able to use them. The turn player is allowed to activate the effect first. Then your opponent is allowed to activate after. If you choose to pass priority to your opponent, you are allowed to chain the effect afterwards too. But with the attack gain of Honest, whoever attacks first is going to win that battle because the effect will resolve backwards. Honest has the ability to
priority.
gain attack points equal to the attack points of the monster that it's attacking. So if you use it first and then your opponent chains an Honest on top of it, it will resolve backwards, where they will gain attack equal to your monster's attack, and then you'll gain attack equal to your opponent's monster's new inflated attack and win the battle. Additionally, if you have multiple Honest in your hand and some quick play spells that modify attack and defense, you're able to use all of them at this point. But this is the last point you're able to use them. It's only permanent cards which have the restrictions where they can only use their effects once. Just to note, monsters with 0 attack cannot destroy anything by battle. So if 2 0 attack monsters battle, nothing happens. Then, once all cards and effects have activated during this step, you compare the attack and defense of your card with your opponent's card to see who won the battle and who would be sent to the grave. If you win the battle, your opponent's monster is set to be destroyed, but it's still on the field at this time. After the damage calculation, we have the fourth step, which is called after damage calculation. This is where you will then activate the effects of your flip monsters, as well as other effects that activate when a card is destroyed by battle or attacks, or when battle damage is inflicted, when you take damage, or effects that activate after damage calculation. So, if you have something like Dummy Golem, for example, which has the flip effect to switch control of itself with one of your opponent's monsters, if it was technically destroyed by that battle, you can't apply its effect, because even though it's still on the field, it's been determined to be set to be destroyed. So you can't do anything with it, because it basically exists in a phased out version on the field where it still is technically on the field, but you can't technically resolve its effect because it's not an
It'll be destroyed.
on the field. And finally, we go to the fifth step of damage calculation, which is called the end of the damage step. If a monster is set to be destroyed, this is where you will finally send it to the graveyard. So since this is the phase of the damage step where you activate the effects of cards and activate when they're destroyed, technically a lot of floating effects, which is a fan term for effects that happen when a card is destroyed, will activate here during the damage step, which means a lot of other effects will not apply. If a Sandgan is destroyed, for example, it will activate its search effect here and can't be negated by Ash Blossom and Joy Spring, because they can't activate the effect of a card which negates an effect during the damage step. And we are still technically in the damage step at this point. This is also where you activate the effects of cards which trigger when you destroy a monster by battle and send it to the graveyard, like Fire Dog. Then, after the end of the damage step, you go back to the battle step. which is basically the entirety of the battle phase, and you can choose more attacks or choose to end the battle phase. Next, let's go over zone placement. Because zone placement matters a lot for Link monsters, there is actually the perfect zone to summon your boss monster to if you want to make sure it's protected, and that is always your rightmost zone. Now, let me explain. There's a
Rightmost.
card called Geonator Transverser, which can swap the positions of monsters that it's diagonal to. So, if it's
Oh.
in the extra monster zone, it targets your middle and leftmost main monster zone, which means you want to avoid these zones so that your monster is not stolen. There is also a card called Relinquished Anima, which is able to absorb the monster directly in front of it, which also means the zones directly below the extra monster zones are unsafe, because Relinquished Anima is able to get the monster that's directly in those two zones. And also, the extra monster zone is unsafe because there's actually a lot of cards that only specifically target monsters in the extra monster zone, which means
Gotcha.
the only safe zone that exists on the board is the rightmost zone. However, most people don't play Geonator Transverser, so you can kind of safely put monsters in
So it
the
doesn't matter
leftmost
too
and
much.
middlemost zone as well, but they are technically not as safe as your rightmost zone. Now let's go over some Yu-Gi-Oh keywords. Technically, Yu-Gi-Oh doesn't really have keywords, except that it does. The first we have is Destroy. Destroy is a keyword which indicates a monster is about to be sent to the graveyard. A card can be destroyed on the field, in your hand, and even in your deck. And if it's destroyed, it always goes to the graveyard, unless there's some kind of floodgate which banishes it instead. The reason this matters is because there are a lot of cards which activate when they are destroyed specifically. So if a card is destroyed in your deck and sent to the graveyard, it will trigger. But if it's sent from your deck to the graveyard, it will not, because it wasn't destroyed, it was
sent.
This distinction is why Zeus is a very powerful board breaker, because it sends all cards on the field to the graveyard, and doesn't technically destroy them. So it gets by a lot
Which
of
is
action
pretty
effects
good.
which prevent destruction, and also around a lot of floating effects which only activate on destruction. Next up we have Banished or Banishment. This is just what happens when
Removed
you
from play.
remove a card from play. It goes into the Banish zone, which until recently wasn't called a zone and was just always called Banishment. Cards can only go to the Banish zone as part of a card effect or a restriction. They do not go there on their own through normal gameplay. Excavate is another keyword, which literally is just an easy way to
Search
say,
your deck.
look at the top cards of your deck until you find one that is specified as part of the effect. So instead of saying, look at the top 3 cards of your deck and then put out a warrior, you could say, excavate the top 3 cards of your deck until you find a warrior and then add it to your hand. Piercing is another keyword, which basically means trample for MTG people, where if a monster attacks a defense vision monster, you can inflict battle damage to your opponent's life points equal to the difference in your attack and that monster's defense, where normally they would take no damage. Negate is another keyword, which basically means it stops the effect of a card from happening. This matters because there are some cards which activate when a card is negated specifically, but won't activate if the effect is just stopped in some other way. And finally, there's targeting. This just means you're selecting a card in order to resolve some kind of
Right,
effect.
because
And
there
while
are
that's
some creatures
basically
that are
it when it comes to
unaffected by
common
targeting.
keywords, there are some more, but we don't really need to go over all of them. I would like to go over targeting a little bit more, but before that, we have to go into colons and semicolons. When a card is activated, you have to meet the conditions of that card before the colon. Otherwise, you're not able to activate the card at all. Once you meet the conditions for the card activation, then you have to pay the cost, which happens after the colon, but before the semicolon. Then this is where you wait for responses. If your opponent has no response, then you're able to resolve the chain and actually apply the effect, which happens after the colon or semicolon, because not all cards have both colons and semicolons. So colons are for conditions that need to be met before the card can be activated. Semicolons are for paying the cost and selecting targets. But targeting is not a cost. It's just done at the same time as paying cost. And then you wait before other cards and effects can be activated in response. And then you'll activate the effect once it's appropriate in the chain. So, if a card does not have a colon or semicolon, then it doesn't start a chain and can be used immediately, which is usually only there for monsters that have a summoning condition like Cyber Dragon. There is an exception with basically all spells and traps, because a lot of them have the condition of just being used from the hand, so they don't state that in the card itself. So there's no need for a lot of them to have colons and semicolons, and they can just detail pure effect, because activating the card is basically its colon. Now we can go into targeting and non-targeting.
Oh, here we go.
When you target a card, this happens before the semicolon, And because you have to target before the effect resolves, it is possible to counter a player card which is about to be targeted for something by like temporarily removing it from the field, for example, or temporarily giving it some kind of protection. Like, for example, if a card targets a face-down card and then the card destroys that face-down target, then if the card is no longer a face-down card, it is no longer a correct target, so it won't get destroyed. However, this was more of a relic of the old cards. Modern cards get around this by just saying destroy it instead of saying destroy that target. So, if you target a face-down card and then it's flipped face up, but the
Ooh,
effect says destroy
345
it
bucks.
instead of
Nice.
destroy that target, the card will still be destroyed because it actually didn't go anywhere, it just changed its state. Also, if a card doesn't designate a target before the semicolon, then it doesn't target. Like, for example, Destiny Hero Destroyer Phoenix Enforcer can destroy one card you control and another card on the field. But this happens after the colon and it doesn't have a semicolon, so it doesn't target. And the cards chosen to be destroyed happen as soon as they are selected when resolving the effect. There's another type of ruling you should be aware of when versus if, where if a card has an optional when effect, then it has a chance to miss timing. For example, a card like Dupe Frog. It has an optional effect that when it's sent from the field to the graveyard, you can add a frog monster from your deck or graveyard to your hand. But if you tribute the card in order to bring out something else, then the effect won't trigger because when effects have to be the last thing that happens. And summoning another monster was the last thing that happened technically with that tribute summon example. But if a card simply says if instead of when, then you can just ignore all of this because it will trigger whenever it can instead of immediately. Why is there a difference between when and if? Well, when effects are generally given to negates, because they can only be responded to immediately after the effect you want to negate. And if they had an if effect, then it wouldn't really make sense with how chains work in Yu-Gi-Oh! Also, it's a way to intentionally nerf some cards, like all of the Paleozoic trap monsters have the effect, where when a trap card is activated, you can special summon it from the graveyard. But if your opponent simply chain blocks your activation of trap cards, they can stop the Paleozoic monster from coming out. A lot of modern cards don't really have when optional floating effects like Dupe Frog anymore, so you don't have to worry about this ruling too much unless you're playing an older format like Edison. Also, if a win effect is mandatory, as in it doesn't allow you to choose to activate it or not, then it also does not miss timing, just like if it was an if effect. So just think of when and if effects like keywords, and just memorize that when can miss timing and if does not. And to cap off this video, let's go over rules versus card effects. Basically, card effects take precedent over the rules, and it's an official rule that says if a card effect says it can do something that is not part of the base rules, then the card effect can do it anyway. Like, for example, a monster can only attack once, but it can have a card effect which allows it to attack twice. Just remember, Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a very complicated game, and there's even more rules I didn't go over, like the mechanics of trap monsters and tokens, but this covers all of the basics.
Which is pretty good. Yeah, still quite a bit from like modern Yu-Gi-Oh! I'm still not too familiar with, and I'm trying to learn. Can't say I'm ever going to get back into playing the game, but it's still nice. Okay, I was hoping the video, next video would start automatically, but I'll have to start it up myself.
Something you will realize if you take a close look at the current ban list is that most banned classic cards are spells and traps. Fact is, most early monsters were not really that good. Save for specific cases, old school monsters don't see any sort of play nowadays because they simply weren't as good as their back row counterparts. While we've still
Love
seen
the old
topping
school
deck
cards
lists for
so
the
much.
Foolish Burial, Imperial Order, and Change of Heart, we don't really see anyone summoning Gravekeeper Sky or Card Trooper. The cards we're going to be looking at today are the exceptions to this, either seeing play beyond their time or completely upheaving the format they were played in. And starting off, we have one of the most well-known monsters to actually be played, Jinzo. This level 6 Dark Machine monster with 2400 attack and 1500 defense has a basic effect emblematic of this era.
Just cancels all trap cards,
preventing the activation of trap cards and their effects, as well as negating their effects on the field, which is a basic but greatly effective ability. Released all the way back
it's a monster version of Royal Decree.
To expand into the new card type introduced in Spell Ruler, Continuous Spells and Traps. Most of these early continuous cards were either bad or completely busted floodgates. That is to say,
Yep.
for every insect barrier and the regulation of tribe, there is gravity bind and imperial order. This set introduced a wide range of extremely powerful trap cards that needed a silver bullet to be kept in check. Cards like Call the Haunted, Mirror Wall, Ceasefire, and the aforementioned Imperial Order were somewhat kept in check by the machine menace that was Jinzo. Limited on release, this card was immediately a staple in most decks. Also being the namesake of the early 2003 format known as Android, which is Jinzo's OCG name. Early Yu-Gi-Oh! Was dominated by powerful traps like Mirror Force, Ring of Destruction, and Sakuretsu Armor, and Jinzo was the one card which could keep them at bay. But Jinzo wasn't just an effect. We also need to mention how well statted it was for its time. When Jinzo
2400
came out,
attack at a level
6
6.
similar stats when we bring out something like Amphibian Beast or Judgeman, only being outclassed by Summon Skull, which has 100 more attack. But the time of normal summons was quickly being left in the past, and we were getting more and more monsters with powerful abilities, which greatly reduced the alternatives you had at the time. Before the Monarchs came out, if you wanted to tribute summon a monster with an effect, you'd be stuck bringing out something like Dragon Seeker or Lava Battle Guard. So yeah, there wasn't much competition. And it seems like Konami realized the power of Jinzo, since when they released its counterpart Spell Canceller, they greatly toned down its stats.
Oh yeah, that one
it
too.
much more in line with what's expected for a level 5 monster at the time. But it's hard to state just how much Jinzo has come in and out of the format throughout the years.
Yeah,
Obviously,
Jinzo's such an icon, and I love him.
Omnipresent until the game really began to speed up with the Dragon Ruler's release. But it's also seen play way beyond that, being played in the 2016 build of Monarchs featuring all their new support, as well as in several combo builds during the Saryuja Scoldred era, where it was a very playable side deck card, since you were able to draw both it and summon it using the aforementioned Saryuja. All of this makes Jinzo one of the best classic Yu-Gi-Oh! Monsters. It seems like early machine monsters were all the rage, because for our number 9 spot, we have the format breaking machine, which was Cyberstein. This level 2 machine with just 700 attack has a shockingly explosive effect for its time. At the low cost of paying 5,000 life points, you can summon one fusion monster from your extra deck in attack position. Simple and to the point.
More than half your life
points.
points.
Really go wrong? Turns out, a lot. You probably know this card from the Cyberstein OTK deck from the late 2006, where it was used in tandem with Megamorph to summon Cyber Twin Dragon or Cyber End Dragon to attack for insane amounts of damage.
And just end your opponent
in one fell swoop. However, Cyberstein is in a weird spot regarding format legality. You see, while it was an easily accessible card in the OCG, it was a Shonen Jump Championship prize card for us in the TCG, making it extremely expensive and limited in quantity. This meant that the few Cybersteins there were being passed around by the very closed teams that populated the Yu-Gi-Oh! Landscape at the time. However,
even trying to get this card is going to be expensive.
Available, but not really capable of being played in most strategies. Where the card really found a place was in Monarch decks, where it could be easily brought out using Last Will after summoning a Monarch, giving you another big body in the form of a strong fusion to close out the game. These two combos eventually proved too powerful and landed the card a good spot on the Forbidden list, where it would stay banned until January 2019, where it came back to 1. At first, the card did not do much, just being played in janky Orcus decks where it could be accessed because of it being a dark machine. It also made an appearance in an extremely greedy FTK decks that changed its type to Psychic with Reproducus and then equipped it with Telekinetic Charging Cell, allowing you to ignore its life point cost. But this combo never really achieved nothing more than looking cool on a replay video. When the card actually became a problem, it was with the advent of Tearlaments and Sprite. In case you haven't noticed, Cyberstein is a level 2 monster, meaning you could either mill it through your Shizu cards, or send it straight to the graveyard with Sprite Sprint, to then bring it back using Sprite Elf, giving you access to either an additional Tearlament fusion like Tearlament Arukulos, or even an Omni Negate in the form of Nature Exterio, although this last card was a lot less common. It was then played in super heavy samurai decks because of its machine typing, as well as other decks. In the end, while still being limited, the card was much more accessible than originally intended, creating a very one-sided play experience, and the card got the ban hammer one last time. An effect this powerful could only be printed in classic cards like this,
of
when
course.
they were still figuring out what was allowed and not allowed.
Yeah, it's seriously 5,000 life points to summon any fusion monster from your extra deck.
For number 8 spot, we find the Master of One and the most popular monster types in the game, Zombie Master. This
Zombie Master is really good.
1800 attack has a very simple but versatile effect, allowing you to summon back any level 4 or lower zombie monster by discarding a monster. This card by itself gave rise to proper zombie decks. In the short period before Synchros came out, this deck was a menace, taking the first place spot in the 2007 SJC Durham. This deck made use of the very strong zombie cards that didn't quite find a consistent home before, like Pyramid Turtle, Ryokoki, Book of Life, and Ilbor. Zombie Master gave these cards a home thanks to finally having a centerpiece to focus the deck around. But that wasn't all. While short-lived as Synchro monsters released shortly after, the late 2007 zombie deck was the one deck to really exploit Card of Safe Return. While probably not really worthy to be banned in 2024 Yu-Gi-Oh!, main decking 3 the card coupled with Zombie Master capable of bringing back a myriad of zombies was crazy. This gave rise to a very short-lived but very well-loved format known as Zombie Format of 2007. Not just that, but with the release of Synchro Monsters, Zombie Master gained a second win that made the card a mainstay of Dark Armed Dragon and other decks looking to make use of its powerful recursive ability, which, fun fact, doesn't need to reborn a zombie from your own graveyard. You could just as easily steal your opponents. But yeah, turns out being able to bring back a bunch of low-level zombies to turn into stuff like Doomkaiser Dragon and Dark Armed Dragon is pretty good. Who would have guessed? With time, the card saw less and less play, but remained an important piece of later Lightsworn brews using Mizuki, and even made appearances in zombie Lightsworn decks that made use of that Grasslick screener, which really benefited from the access to rank 4s, which Zombie Master provided. All in all, Zombie Master is a very iconic card that a lot of players hold
Zombie Master is a fun card.
It a spot on today's list. And flying into number 7, we find Elemental Hero Stratos. Does this guy even need an introduction?
I used to have Stratos.
With 1800 attack,
I think I did get him from like a Shonen Jump
monster, or
magazine.
Spells and traps in the field up to the number of other hero monsters you control.
I don't know what happened to him.
And emblematic. That's what Stratos is. Ever since its release,
Might have been what happened to my Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon and I just lost him.
From the moment it was released, the card gave rise to the Diamond Dude Turbo deck, sometimes called Airblade, after Stratos' OCG name being Airman and using Divine Sword Phoenix Blade. This was the first actual hero deck, making use of the aforementioned Destiny Hero Diamond Dude to play powerful spells like Magical Stone Excavation or Destiny Draw without paying their activation costs. Not just that, the deck had access to some of the craziest cards of its time, like Heavy Storm, Dimensional Fusion, and Emergency Call. This mash of crazy powerful spells all was enabled thanks to Stratos' ability to grant the deck unparalleled consistency. But the card didn't rest after this deck. Far from it. While limited shortly after its release, Stratos did anything but fall off. The most immediate deck that housed Airman
did that card get banned?
That is, Dark Armed Dragon variants of Diamond Dude Turbo decks. The consistency provided by the hero engine really helped summoning Dark Armed Dragon, filling the graveyard and also allowing you to get back your banished dark monsters with Dimension Fusion, which could be found much easier thanks to Destiny Hero Diamond Dude, as well as having access to Destiny Hero Plasma as an almost auto win button. All of this facilitated by the insane consistency tool that is Stratos. But when Dark Armed Dragon left, Stratos did not. Edison format has given the card a lot more attention than its time did. Some of the most powerful decks of the format feature our beloved Stratos, Diva Hero, and Hero Frog. And beyond this, Stratos was an auto-include in the Hero Beat / Bubble Beat decks of the early 2010s, a deck that sought to overwhelm your opponent by using level 4 monsters with massive bodies. The main one being Elemental Hero Neos Alias, which could be coupled with the extremely powerful Gemini Spark to allow for removal on top of having a large body. But it would be shortly after, in late 2013, when Stratos would finally get the bullet and be banned for a very long time. This banning was met with disdain from the entire community.
Everybody loves Stratos.
An easily accessible deck in a format filled with overwhelming decks like Dragon Rulers and Spellbooks. Still, it wouldn't be until 2018 when Stratos finally came back to widespread celebration. Sadly, the hero deck was a bit rusty by then, not really capable of achieving much. But, well, Hero wouldn't be the archetype with the most support for nothing, as it kept on getting new cards that managed to push it to rogue relevancy sporadically since around 2020. All of them obviously featuring Elemental Hero Stratos.
Stratos is good.
In the TCG, Stratos earns a solid spot on this list, thanks to its versatility and facilitating pretty much every hero variant you could imagine. And at number 6, we have another card emblematic of its era, Light and Darkness Dragon. How does an sound like 2007?
I think
Pretty
I
good,
sold
right?
that card.
Well, what about 4 in this same card? Light and Darkness Dragon is the level 8 like dragon that cannot be special summoned and treats itself as both light and dark while on the field. Most importantly, as a
double
once per
attribute,
chain, not once per turn, you must negate and destroy any spell, trap, or monster effect that is activated at the cost of losing 500 attack and defense.
That's
then,
fine.
When it is destroyed and sent to the graveyard, you special back any monster from your graveyard at the cost of destroying all cards you control. Now, the
Hmm.
only thing keeping this card from being the best card in the game is all the restrictions it has. Firstly, you must normal summon it. No summon from
Yep.
the grave with Guard Dragon Pitsy or with its own effects. Secondly, both its activated effects are mandatory. That means you must negate whatever effect is activated, be it yours or your opponent's. And you
Oh.
must destroy all your cards when Light and Darkness Dragon is destroyed. Even with all these limitations, the card managed to amass dozens and dozens of tops, being the boss monster of several decks. Just when the card was released, it gave rise to one of the most well-known meta decks in the community, Perfect Circle. This deck featured a hero engine that gave you extreme consistency, and would eventually see the ban of the engine's most emblematic card, Destiny
Buy-in.
Hero Disc Commander. Summoning it back with Destiny Hero Fearmonger was the deck's main play, allowing you to tribute for Light and Darkness Dragon using the Disc Commander, and a Destiny Hero Malicious or one of the other deck's ways of getting fodder into the board. Once you did, you essentially just won the game. You had a big body that would negate any plays done by your opponent, and would get you Disc Commander back when they outed Lad, and that would accumulate resources while your opponent struggled to even play the game. Even as this deck fell to the wayside, Light and Darkness Dragon has found itself in a myriad of strategies throughout the years, be it in Dark Arm Dragon decks like the mini cards of its time, in the first place Quick Draw Dandy Warrior list that took SJC Edison, or as probably the best thing to summon in any and all versions of the Frog Monarch deck. It doesn't really matter what deck you played in, Light and Darkness Dragon is an amazing card with a lot of flavor, ties
Yeah.
to the GX manga, and is a lot of players' favorite for good reason.
I think I did end
Seldom
up
do we
selling
see
that
cards
card
this
not too long
powerful,
ago.
much less as early as 2007,
It was
and
still
it
stupid of
shows.
me to do so.
Probably the most unassuming card on this list.
Also, hey,
at number
Gara.
5, we have Treeborn Frog. This level 1 Aqua with just 100 attack and defense features one of the most useful abilities in the game. As a once per turn effect during your standby phase, while you control no monsters named Treeborn Frog and no spells or traps, Treeborn Frog will summon itself from the graveyard. Now, this seems good,
That's really
but it's hard
good.
to understand just exactly how good it is. Released all the way back in 2006, Shadow of Infinity,
Just get a free
this little
monster.
froglet managed to revive itself into pretty much every topping deck for years. Immediately upon release, this card gave birth to the deck that would best exploit its revival ability, Frog Monarch. The Monarch series of monsters were playable generic cards that saw some relevance in different decks, but never as a strategy of their own. That would change with the advent of Frog Monarch, a deck that would continue to be relevant for ages, only really dropping out of the meta all the way in 2014. And it's hard to understate just how relevant and powerful this deck was. While the first Monarchs the deck had access to were a bit underwhelming, they still were powerhouses for their time. Being able to drop a Mobius the Frost Monarch or
God, all those monarchs are so good, but I don't think I have like an actual monarch card.
was considered strong. Filled with generic warrior engines to tie everything together, Frog Monarch started with a bang, but hadn't yet become the best it would. As it would be expected, Treeborn Frog quickly earned a spot on the limited list just a month after its release.
Oh,
That
just
certainly
limited?
did not stop the deck from dominating the metagame. The deck shortly mutated into a Chaos deck, making use of the well-known power of Chaos Sorcerer and Magician of Faith. It
Ooh,
also
Chaos
incorporated
Sorcerer.
Cyberstein, like we mentioned previously in this video, thanks to the Monarch's powerful synergy with Last Will. And with time, the versatility of the Monarchs allowed the deck to adapt to what the rest of the meta was. Need to remove cards from your opponent's hand? Just pop in Thestalos the Firestorm Monarch. Front by back row, just add in Grandmarg the Rock Monarch. Fact is, the engine was so good, even non-Monarch decks were side decking it. But Monarchs were an archetype, and archetypes get support. Rise of the Storm Monarch was a massive boon for the deck, allowing actually good and generic spot removal, and also permitting the engine to be played in a lot of different decks, be it Diamond 2 Turbo or Machine Brews using Cyber Phoenix. But the card really became a menace when Caius the Shadow Monarch released in 2008. It's hard to
Ooh.
understate just how much of an impact this card made. But it wasn't all Monarchs, oh no sir. You see, Konami decided to print Substitoad, and then an FTK won the World Championship, featuring the new semi-limited Treeborn Frog as a recursive frog to tribute with Substitoad. Even after the deck's banning, Treeborn Frog continued to be relevant for a while, being an important part of the very underrated frog deck making use of Sea Lancer. So yeah,
Nice.
it's safe to say the card earned a spot on this list. If there's a card that just seems broken upon first reading, that has to be our number 4 spot, Makura the Destructor. This level 4 Dark Warrior was released in 2004, and for just 5 months made sure to be a pain in the butt for all Yu-Gi-Oh players. To put it simply, Makura resolving spelled the end of the game. One of the first combos that made the card busted was with one of the weirdest cards to be in the ban list, Dark Scorpion Chick the Yellow. The combo was pretty simple. You just need to have Chick in the graveyard, Makura's effect apply that turn, and Call of the Haunted in your hand. And this would win you the game. It went like this. You
Wait.
activate Call the Haunted to summon back Chick the Yellow, then attack with him, deal damage, and return your own Call the Haunted to your hand, sending Chick to the graveyard. You then activate Call the Haunted directly from your hand during the same battle phase, summon Chick the Yellow back, attack, return Call the Haunted, and keep doing this until your opponent could no longer play the game because you dealt infinite damage. Now, this is kind of underwhelming, honestly. When you think about Macula Structure, you think about one of two combos. Either activating cards like Jar of Greed, Legacy of Yanagarasa, and Reckless Greed to draw through
Oh,
your
so
entire
that just
deck
allows you to
resolve
play
Exodia
traps from
with
your
one.
hand.
Or much scarier, you activated Exchange of the Spirit. Pretty mind-numbing, obviously. You do essentially the same thing you would do with Exodia combo. Turbo your way through your deck, fill up your graveyard, and then use Exchange of Spirit to swap decks and graveyards, making your opponent's deck become 0 cards, and winning the game by just passing turn. Now, you
Jeez.
have to keep in mind that while both Macula Destructor and Exchange of the Spirit are currently legal, this combo is no longer possible. This is because these cards were unbanned by giving them an errata, effectively butchering the power of both cards. And
Aw.
for good reason, since if Macula Destructor was legal in the current format, the game would be plagued by insane trap combo decks that give you access to anything you could ever want, most often winning in the first turn. And this is why Macula destroys his way into this top 10. First in the top 3 is another card that received an errata, Dark Magician of Chaos. This level 8
Yeah.
spellcaster with a beefy 2800 attack body has an honestly insane effect for its time. For
Now, this
starters,
card
it
I can't
banishes
remember if
any
I ever
monster
had or
destroyed by
not.
battle. But most importantly, when it's summoned, you can return any spell card from your graveyard to your hand. And to balance all this, Dark Magician of Chaos would be banished when it leaves the field. In case it bears repeating, during the early days of Yu-Gi-Oh!, the best card type was by far spells. Just
Yes.
in GOAT format, you
Spells
had
are good.
Metamorphosis, Pot of Greed, Heavy Storm, Delinquent Duo, Graceful Charity, among many others. Being able to essentially double any spell you play while also getting a large body out of the exchange was unheard of at the time. Graveyard recursion was greatly limited in this time period. The most powerful card with that effect being Magician of Faith, a card also well deserving a spot on today's list. Dark Magician of Chaos simply skipped a basic rule of the game, allowing you to reuse spells that have already been spent, and sort of ignoring the ban list for limited cards like Premature Burial, one of the cards that best worked with this spellcaster. While it was played in several decks during the GOAT format era of the game, the one that made better use of it was Reasoning Gate, a deck using both Reasoning and Monster Gate to get out Sacred Crane for draws, which exploited Dark Magician of Chaos for recouping those two powerful spells that you could fill up your graveyard with more spells, while also getting you a free monster. But let's not forget his first effect, banishing whatever it destroys in battle. Early Yu-Gi-Oh! Is filled with Recruiters, a series of monsters that special summon a monster of their own attribute when destroyed by battle and sent to the graveyard. Cards like Mystic Tomato and Giant Rat, which are otherwise powerful staples of the format, become useless in the face of Dark
When they're
Magician of Chaos,
banished.
hitting them for 1400 damage and preventing their powerful consistency effects from triggering. While the card was still powerful, it took a little bit to find a home after GOAT format came and went. But Diamond Dude Turbo knew how to really milk this classic card. We already covered this deck before in this video, so just picture the following. You activate the effect of Destiny Hero Diamond Dude, excavating Graceful Charity, and send it to the graveyard. Then you activate Monster Gate, tributing Diamond Dude, and summon Dark Magician of Chaos, and use its effect to add back Graceful Charity. You activate Graceful Charity. Next turn, you activate Graceful Charity again off of Diamond Dude's effect. Yeah, kind of crazy, huh? And this wasn't even the reason it got banned. Dark Arm Dragon took a lot of cards with it, and Dark Magician of Chaos was one of them. So in late 2008, it became banned for a long time. It eventually was unlimited in April 2016, following an errata limiting the adding back of the spells to the end phase of the turn it was summoned only, effectively making the card unplayable. But again, it's pretty crazy that a card as strong as Dark Magician of Chaos was printed all the way back in 2004, earning a solid spot on our list. And at number 2 is the only fusion monster on this list, Gladiator Beast Gyzarus. Barely making the cut for what qualifies as classic Yu-Gi-Oh!, Gyzarus completely tore the format apart it was released into. Before this point, the extra deck was essentially irrelevant. Sure, you could use it in GOAT format when Metamorphosis was relevant, and also whenever Cyberstein was played, but you never actually did a fusion summon. This is in good part due to the fact that early fusion monsters kind of irredeemably bad. Don't try to gaslight yourself. You are not activating polymerization to use Tainted Wisdom and Ancient Brain into a Skull Knight.
No,
Gyzarus and
not
the Gladiator
even.
Beast radically changed his perception that the fusion monsters were playable. As a level 6 with 2400 attack, Gladiator Beast Gyzarus crashed with all monarchs and easily cleared most monsters that were played at the time. But you were absolutely not clearing monsters by attacking with him. Oh no. For when Gyzarus is special summoned, it targets 2 cards on the field and destroys them. This is crazy good in a monster as easy to bring out as this one. simply requiring you to shuffle back Gladiator Beast Bistari as well as one other Gladiator Beast monster in order to contact fuse it from your extra deck. On top of that, it also has a beefed up version of the Gladiator Beast effect, shuffling back itself into the deck after battling to bring out 2 Gladiator Beasts from your deck, with the
Oh.
exception of Bistari, to
Okay,
prevent
yeah,
a silly
that's
lose.
good.
While Gladiator Beast was technically an archetype before this card's release, it failed to achieve anything until this pure advantage Beast release. Easily accessible at pretty much any point, Gyzaris catapulted this archetype into what some pro players consider to be the actual first Tier 0 deck in the game, and it would stay in the top
Tier
tables
zero.
for a good while at that. Released together with TCG exclusive card Test Tiger, Gyzaris rose from the ashes of the Dark Arm Dragon format to take over the metagame with an iron fist. Taking up 6 of the top 8 cut slots in SJC St. Louis 2008, Gladiator Beast quickly became the deck to beat, a deck that required players to main deck answers specifically dedicated to beating the matchup. One of the most flagrant examples was Monarch players electing to play Prime Material Dragon to counter both Gladiator Beast Myrmilio as well as Gladiator Beast Gyzaris. But yeah, Gyzaris made Gladiator Beast one of the most relevant decks in the game's history, taking top after top for years until the release of XC's monsters, when the deck really slowed down and became irrelevant since the release of Dragon Rulers. While the deck has received extremely powerful support in the form of Gladiator Beast Tamer Editor and Gladiator Beast Dominatus, none of them compare to the sheer impact Gladiator Beast Gyzaris meant for both its archetype as well as the game as a whole. Now, before we get to our number 1 spot, we have a few honorable mentions to go through, which are only honorable mentions because we talked about them too much in other videos on this channel. First off, there's Magical Scientist. Sure, it's really strong, but you probably already know why it's good by now. Being one of the best levels in the game, and including a fact that allows you to cheat a basic game mechanic like fusion summoning in order to either get a massive advantage, or to end the game on the first turn with a card like Catapult Turtle. Secondly, there's Dark Arm Dragon. We've mentioned this deck for the whole video, and for good reason. This card spelled one of the most divisive formats in the game's history, as well as the most inaccessible. Dark Arm Dragon punched through the ceiling what was considered a good monster in 2008, and rose to the heights that would take a long time to be reached again. Coupled with Return for the Different Dimension, the Hero Engine, and Emergency Teleport with Crabons, both Dad Return and Teledad completely dominated the end of the Fusion era, and even the start of the Synchro era with their versatility and sheer strength of Dark Arm Dragon. And last but not least, the pretty obvious call, Chaos Emperor Dragon Envoy of the End. Everyone knows this dude by now. Banish a light and dark, nuke literally everything, then just keep your opponent from playing with Yatagarasu if you haven't won
It's
yet.
insanely
Invasion of
powerful.
Chaos brought with it a series of monsters that would define card design for the rest of the game, and Chaos Emperor Dragon is by far the most explosive of them, being strong enough to force the first banning in the game's history.
And of
But
course,
for
it's had to have
talking
its
about Chaos monsters,
rules
one of them
changed.
still takes the crown while also not being banned from talked about from being mentioned so much in other videos. One of the most emblematic card in the game's history, a monster that holds significance both in the anime as well as in the card game, which heralded one of the most significant changes in the game's history, Blackluster Soldier, Envoy of the Beginning.
I
This
swear
level
I had
warrior
this
with
card
3000
too.
attack was so far beyond anything else released previously that it's supposed as one of the biggest jumps in power creep the game has ever experienced. Unable to be
I
normal
wish
summoned,
I
it can
knew
special summon itself
what I
by
did with
banishing
that
a light or
card.
dark monster from your grave. Once on your board, it can do one of two things. Either banish one monster on the field in exchange for not being able to attack that turn, or attack a second time if it destroys a monster by battle. This was monumental. The release of Invasion of Chaos, and more specifically Blackluster Soldier Envoy of the Beginning, was akin to dropping a nuclear bomb in the middle of cavemen fighting wolves. It's really strong,
pretty much.
obviously, but you're not really using it to its full potential yet. While players are quick to justify the impact that Invasion of Chaos had through Chaos Emperor Dragon Envoy of the End, it's no blasphemy to say that Blackluster Soldier Envoy of the Beginning was the better of the two in the long run, and probably
Very much
also
so.
on release. After the short stint of playability its draconic counterpart had, BLS quickly became a mainstay in the format for the following decade. An obvious include in early Chaos decks, the card was the boss monster not just of its own deck, but of the game as a whole. Nothing even comes close to the finality it represented. A free summon that could either permanently remove a monster, or go for a quick game sprint. It was simply insane. These early builds struggled from the lack of good light monsters, but found massive success nonetheless. Chaos decks completely dominated 2005, finally having access to a good generic light monster in Cyber Dragon, and ruled the game until the card's eventual banning in October of 2005. It wouldn't be until September 2011 when Konami decided it was time to banish a light and dark again. Blackluster Soldier Envoy of the Beginning came back in a very different game than the one he last saw the last time he was legal. Reborn Tengu was the name of the game, and the game was synchro summoning. But the more things changed, the more they stayed the same. Even 6 years after being banned in a Sea of Trishula, Dragon of the Ice Barrier, and number 39 Utopia, a free big body that could out monsters or attack for game was extremely valuable. At
Yeah.
first, the card was simply slotted into existing Reborn Tengu lists, but soon found a home in a dedicated Chaos Shell, making use of Effect Veiler and Tour Guide from the Underworld, as well as Thunder King Ryo. Getting lights and darks into the grave was never easier, and Chaos monsters gained the upper hand thanks to this.
Big spender.
Not just that, but the release of the Agent Structure deck gave a new home to the soldier, now together in a deck with another iconic boss monster, Master Hyperion. With time, the format changed, but BLS remained a staple in most decks. Even Dino Rabbit was main deck in it for its sheer power and ability to easily out Evilsaur Logia and wind up Zen mains. But when the card really started to gain speed was when the Chaos Dragon deck started to become a thing. Its synergy with Eclipse of Wyvern was amazing, letting you fetch something like Light Pulsar Dragon or Red Eyes Darkness Metal Dragon, making for one of the most fun decks of its time. The card would find a different role a couple of years later in the wings of another 7 power creep with the release of Duelist Alliance and Shadow with it. This dark-centric deck had no problem setting up chaos plays thanks to El Shadow Construct and Shadow Fusion, enabling both Blackluster Soldier Envoy of the End, as well as White Dragon Wyvern Burstern and Black Dragon Collapse Serpent. Heck, even Burning Abyss stacks were main deck in the card because of how good it was in that format, able to be an out to the aforementioned construct much more easily than the deck would usually have access to. It would continue to dominate the game in Shadow Brews, until being overtaken by the Phantom Knights build of Burning Abyss, and after that, falling out of favor. While still played in both Thunder Dragon and Burning Abyss all the way until January of 2019, the card completely dropped off in popularity after that, not being able to reach another top cut since then. But as bittersweet as it is seeing the card disappear from the metagame, I think Blackluster Soldier Envoy of the Beginning has earned a well-deserved rest after 15 years of being the largest threat you could summon for its cost.
That is impressive.
It solidly earns its spot as the best monster from classic Yu-Gi-Oh! We're starting this list off at number 10 with a rock-solid choice that never saw a great deal of competitive play, but was a powerful staple in Playground format. It's Giant Soldier of Stone, a level 3 Earth Rock normal monster with a frankly baffling attack of 1300 and low-level premium stats of 2000 defense. One of the most available cards
Giant Soldier
ever,
of Stone is
Giant
fun.
Soldier of Stone was gettable right from the start in the early days of August 2002 as part of Yu-Gi-Oh's first set, The Legend of Blue Eyes White Dragon, and would go on to catch a reprint a couple weeks later in Starter Deck Yugi, and again the next year as part of Starter Deck Pegasus, with way more printing since then that are worth mentioning here. While Giant Soldier of Stone lacked the kind of effect that will earn other cards their spot on this list, most cards from the Legend of Blue Eyes White Dragon were completely effectless. In fact, most of the few effects to be printed in the game's inaugural set were flip cards, including Armored Ninja, Hangman, Man-Eater Bug, and Reaper of the Cards, with the only non-flip exceptions being Exodia the Forbidden One. While the set also
to get my hands on all the Exodia cards.
2000 attack like Trihorn Dragon, Dark Magician, and predictably Blue Eyes White Dragon, the accolade for the low-level monster with the highest attack goes to Skull Red Bird with 1550 attack. That's not bad for a low-level monster, even today, but it's also only 250 higher than the Giant Soldier of Stone, a monster that's a whole level lower and has good defensive utility. Just setting Giant Soldier of Stone in passing walled most cards in the format.
Such a low level, but it's got a very good attack and defense.
Dragon and Gaia the Dragon Champion, in addition to the previously listed high levels able to beat Over Soldier. Luckily, the Legend of Blue Eyes White Dragon makes up for what it's missing in monster cards with some of the most powerful and longest lasting spells in the game, like Dark Hole and Raigeki, providing more
and I think
options
Pot of
to
Greed
deal
was
with the
also in
There were other monsters
LOB.
with the sweet 2000 defense, but they were Mystical Elf and Spirit of the Harp, who both had less than 1000 attack. Giant Soldier of Stone's closest competition was Aquamador, who shared the 2000 defense but backed it up with 1200 attack,
and one level higher.
Weaker. More important than that missing 100 though was Aquamador's lack of accessibility compared to Giant Soldier, since you couldn't pick up the confirmed copy of Mador from Starter Deck Yugi. And another thing, every other 2000 defense low-level wall was a higher level than Giant Soldier of Stone, despite being worse. Although its relative strength would not survive the power creep of sets to come, Giant Soldier Stone was an equalizing force in some of the game's earliest days of play, and possibly its loosest format ever, Playground Yu-Gi-Oh!, where fledgling duelists would just use whatever they had and see how things went. And fitting for such an iconic early card, Giant Soldier Stone had a ton of anime appearances in the Duel Monsters anime,
Of
And it was
course.
a favorite stall card of the original protagonist, Yugi Moto, no doubt contributing to the card's cultural popularity. In its first appearance in episode 7 during Yugi's duel against Mako Tsunami, Giant Soldier Stone was critical to Yugi's victory, since having it attacking Yugi's own equip spell, Mystical Moon, caused the ocean hiding Mako's predatory sea monsters to recede,
Good old anime
resulting in a near
nonsense.
instant loss for the fish guy. This fascinating engagement would go on to inspire the continuous spell, Attack the Moon, which both features Giant Soldier of Stone in the artwork and references the episode by allowing a player to destroy a spell or trap card
Which is
after
funny.
a rock monster changes its battle position. Giant Soldier of Stone's final appearance on the field would come in episode 168 when the pharaoh wrestled with darkness and guilt within his own heart by dueling an apparition of his vessel Yugi Moto, whose erstwhile soul was at the time abducted by the Great Leviathan on account of the pharaoh's lack of restraint. Its final appearance overall was in episode 220 during Yugi Moto's deck building session prior to his ceremonial duel with the pharaoh. But this isn't quite the end for the Giant Soldier. Its iconic status would carry it to a few more appearances in Yu-Gi-Oh! GX and Yu-Gi-Oh! 5Es, although it wouldn't hit the field in either show. While it
Oh.
wouldn't go on to see competitive play, it has been featured in more artworks. There's Attack the Moon, like we already went over, but there's also Miracle Rupture, Weed Out, Ivy Shackles, Draw Muscle, and a Lineage of Destruction. On top of this, it's also got 2 retrains in the form of Sentry Soldier of Stone and a Giant Soldier of Steel. The notoriety of being one of the game's earliest, most overpowered normal monsters is definitely enough to earn Giant Soldier of Stone its spot on this list.
Yeah.
However, from here on out, we're going to be focusing on cards with effects that had a greater impact on the game overall. But as we move forward into rougher terrain, we can relax in the knowledge that the Giant Soldier Stone has got our backs at number 10, just like it defended many of the first duelists of old. And sharing the number 9 spot on this list are the 6 elemental battle searchers: Shining Angel,
Oh,
Rat,
yeah.
Grizzly, Flying Chimera number 1, UFO Turtle, and Mystic Tomato, released together about a month and a half after Giant Soldier Stone in Yu-Gi-Oh's second set, Spell Ruler. They're all level 4s with 1400 attack and defense that ranges from 800 at the low end and 1200 on the highest end. Their effects are all technically different, but complementary in that they all accomplish the same thing for their different attributes.
They can all
which is
special
why
summon
there
a
are
monster
6 of them,
1500
one for
attack
each
or
Lance
less,
Divine. When
depending
Giant
on the
Rat is destroyed
attribute.
by battle and sent to the graveyard, you're able to special summon any Earth monster with less than 1500 attack from your deck in attack mode. Mother Grizzly does the same thing, but for water monsters. And UFO Turtle for fire, Mystic Tomato for dark, Flying Kamakiri number 1 for wind, and Shining Angel for light.
I know for
These
sure
are
I
some
had
of
the Flying
earliest
Kamakiri.
examples of what would come to be known as floating effects, a fundamental force in the modern game. Floating effects are what happens when a monster or card leaves the field. Being able to dark hole or battle your opponent's monsters away doesn't mean much when destroying their Silent Magician causes it to float into a copy of Silent Magician level 8 from the deck. While the floating effects of the Elemental Searchers from Spell Ruler are quite conditional in that they only activate after being destroyed by battle and sent to the graveyard, future evolutions of the
Yep, it
concept
has to be
would
by
have
battle.
much more difficult to circumvent triggers like leaving the field because of an opponent's card. Still, in those early days, there were less tools for sending cards to places that weren't the graveyard, like banishment, the hand, or back to the deck. Hane and Penguin Soldier can only do so much heavy lifting. Perhaps the best facet of the Elemental Battle Searchers was that since they all had 1400 attack and could search monsters with 1500 or less, they could search themselves. A UFO turtle destroyed by battle can float into another UFO turtle that can float into a third UFO turtle, if you've got that many, before floating into something else. Your life points weren't totally safe since these searchers had to special summon in attack position, but 1400 is a decent chunk, especially when repeatedly subtracted from damage you would have taken. While they're nothing you'd consider competitive today, the fact that they had a completely generic search beyond the attack and attribute constraint gave them a lot of potential synergies. In particular, Shining Angel Mystic Tomato saw considerable competitive play, which is
Oh yeah, for
understandable
light and
since light
darkness.
and dark have historically been the game's strongest attributes. Mystic Tomato, in particular, saw use in many decks, including Insectors, Zombies, and Teledad. The fact that these
Oh
searchers
yeah,
don't have a level
zombies.
restriction even means that you could use Mystic Tomato to search a low attack level 10 like Yubel. Truly cunning duelists would even foist their elemental searchers
Oh
onto
yeah,
their
levels
opponent
don't
with
even
cards like
matter.
Creature Swap and Mystic Box before attacking over them for a free floating search. And reigning over the number 8 spot on this list is King of the Swamp, a level 3 water aqua monster
Oh, a
with
fusion
500 attack
substitute.
and 1000 defense from the 2004 set Ancient Sanctuary. In addition to ruling swamps, King of the Swamp also lords over Yu-Gi-Oh's early days fusion support. One of the biggest troubles with fusion monsters hasn't changed since the very beginning. Searching out 2 or more specific names, plus a polymerization or lookalike to summon one monster from the extra deck is incredibly resource inefficient. This became very quickly evident through the popularity of cards that made accessing the fusion deck easier, like Metamorphosis and Cyberstein. This is another trend that would continue with instant and ready fusion, but King of the Swamp was an excellent piece of early polymerization support that went toward making fusion strategies playable. So what does it do? Well, firstly, it can activate from the hand, discard itself to search out polymerization from your deck. This alone would make it worth consideration for fusion decks in the time-gated format, since it's basically just a fusion sage you can use to thin your deck, but with the option to set in defense position if you badly needed a body. But what earns King of the Swamp its royal status and spot on this list is the added flexibility it gets from also being able to count itself as a fusion substitute
Yes,
for
that's
any one
it.
fusion material monster. This effect is shared by a few other cards, notably Mystical Sheep number 1, Versago the Destroyer, and Beast King of the Swamp, all from back in 2002. But not only did they lack King of the Swamp's polymerization search effect, they also weren't widely available to play. The 3 earliest fusion substitutes were all distributed as pools from the tournament packs, with Versago and Beast King first printing in Tournament Pack 1, and Mystical Sheep following in Tournament Pack 2. Though they'd all catch reprints with Tournament Pack 5, King of the Swamp's presence as a rare in Ancient Sanctuary, plus a soon-to-follow second run in Dark Revelation Volume 2, made it not only the best, but the most obtainable fusion substitute. Interestingly, King of the Swamp wouldn't actually begin to see considerable competitive placement until 2016 as part of the Frightfur strategy.
Oh,
A
jeez.
line of fusion fiends that arise from patching together the cute fairy fluffles with devious edge imps. The Frightfurs were interesting as they wanted to use both polymerization and their archetype fusion spell Frightfur Fusion. Polymerization was great for getting your fluffles and imps into the graveyard, which is where Frightfur Fusion would then banish them to call out more powerful monsters from the extra deck. Not only could King of the Swamp search polymerization, but it could benefit from fluffles like Owl and Cat, who could also search polymerization, freeing King of the Swamp to act as a substitute for Edge Imp Sabrus or other materials specifically mentioned by Frightfur monsters. From there, King of the Swamp would also see niche experimentation and strategies to come, particularly tier limits. King of the Swamp is a retrain of the earlier Beast King of the Swamp, and the Swamp would continue to be an important epicenter for fusion-related cards in the dual monsterverse for years to come. Mudragon of the Swamp is a fusion with generic materials, only requiring 2 monsters of the same attribute, making it a common target for spells like Super Polymerization. Muddy Mudragon is a level 6 synchro that's also a fusion substitute, with an on-field activated effect to essentially become polymerization. Baby Mudragon synergizes with both of its older forms, and the different dimension demons would sign a dark contract with the Swamp King to gain access to the Swamp's primal penchant for fusion summoning. King of the Swamp had 1 appearance in the Yu-Gi-Oh! GX anime used against Jade and Yuki in episode 158
GX.
by Truman, who was able to leverage King of the Swamp's substitute effect to have it act as Red Eyes Black Dragon in a big play to summon Meteor Beat Dragon. Flip
Ooh.
effect monsters aren't known for
Ooh.
being particularly powerful
Got a full art.
within the game
Nice.
of Yu-Gi-Oh! While they saw some play in the earlier days when the pace of
Another
the game
one.
was friendlier towards
Sick.
effects that take time to activate, it's hard to rely on a card that might or might not go off on turn 2 when minigames are
Alright, I'll help
turn
you. Just
3.
give me a second.
Even flip monsters that seem wildly powerful, like mimicking Maneater Bug, are kind of blah.
There you go.
Which is why we're excited to award the number 7 spot on this list to one of Yu-Gi-Oh's most broken cards, the level 3 Earth Plant flip effect monster, Fiber Jar. Releasing back in the
What does that one do
2003
again?
set Legacy of Darkness, Fiber Jar is legal to play pretty much nowhere, not even in GOAT format, where
Oh.
you could run Pot of Greed and it's fine. Part of the trouble with flip monsters is that because they're so inconvenient, they need to be super impactful to justify see and play. The
Right.
trouble here is that there's a fine line between a good effect that's not really good enough and being irredeemably broken, which brings us to Fiber Jar. When it flips, both players shuffle all cards from their hand, field, and graveyard into the deck and then draw 5 cards. This effect is obviously bogus, since it's pretty much a reset button for the entire game. But
Oh,
not
that's
exactly.
why.
There's one key difference. Whether your opponent attacked into Fiber Jar during their battle phase, or you flipped Fiber Jar during your main phase, possibly using a card like Book of Taiyu to accomplish this on the same turn, you're able to continue playing like it's your turn 1, only this time you can attack. Fiber Jar is bananas broken, and it's actually on this list as a representative for a whole line of powerful Jar flip effect monsters from early Yu-Gi-Oh! Morphing Jar, whose effect causes both players to discard their
Oh yeah,
cards and draw
Morphing
5,
Jar. That's another
would
sick
waffle
card.
between being limited to 1 and outright banned over the years. And Cyber Jar only recently was let back into the game at 1 copy after 17 years of lockout. Morphing Jar number 2 did
Cyber
its time
Jar.
both semi-limited and banned, but Fiber Jar holds the competitive title of most banned jar, and for that gets the number 7 spot on this list.
Yeah,
You're
that's
talking
fair.
about a monster that can single-handedly disrupt your hand, field, and graveyard and pretty much restart the duel as you feeling a little nervous. Don't worry, because the number 6 pick for this list has come to save you. Here to help is Rescue Cat, a level 4 Earth Beast with 300 attack and 100 defense from 2005's Flaming Eternity set. Rescue Cat has the effect to send itself from field to graveyard to special summon 2 level 3 or lower beast monsters from your deck. They're destroyed during the end phase, but the effect to trade out for 2 monsters of your choice from deck is wildly impactful. Like King of the Swamp, Rescue Cat would see the greatest amount of play after the classic era for its synergy with the other extra deck summoning
Oh,
mechanics,
right.
like Synchro and Xyz. But it would actually hit its highest spike in the Twilight era of classic Yu-Gi-Oh! With 55 competitive placements from April through September of 2008. The major reason for this spike in Rescue Cat relevance were the Gladiator Beasts. This archetype of monsters doesn't actually have as many beasts in the name as it implies, but they do have Test Tiger, a level 3 beast that contributes itself to target a Gladiator Beast you control, and shuffle back into the deck in order to special summon another Gladiator Beast, treating that monster as if it was special summoned by the effect of a Gladiator Beast.
Okay,
That all
that's
sounds
crazy.
quite complicated, but it's Yu-Gi-Oh! So what do you expect? The
Eh.
idea behind the Gladiator Beasts was that at the end of the battle phase, after they engaged in battle, they'd be able to tap out of the arena, shuffling themselves back to tag a fellow gladiator to the field from the deck when they do. The new monster arrives with a roar, activating powerful effects that only go off when special summoned by the effect of a Gladiator Beast monster. Test Tiger, and by extension Rescue Cat, who is basically 2 Test Tigers, was able to pull those effects off without relying on the dangerous battle phase. And although the Gladiator Beast days would prove to be Rescue Cat's most impactful, its effect to summon from the deck would only get more versatile as time went on. New summoning
Yeah.
mechanics would help it graduate into new archetypes, like X-Sabers and Zodiacs, and even Burning Abyss as a 1-card combo for the vital rank 3 generic XCs, Dante, Traveler of the Burning Abyss. Tragically for such a cute card, but it was definitely a really
It would be
fun
getting
choice
the
at the
ban,
time.
wouldn't it?
Rescue Cat would catch a ban in 2010 for the
Yep.
Synchro Cat decks that would build around it, which used Rescue Cat's instant access to tuners to
Oh, of
pull
course it
together
would
a
work with
lethal
Synchro
OTK.
decks.
By first clearing your opponent's back row with cards like Cold Wave, Giant Trunade, and Heavy Storm, you could safely use Summoner Monk to summon a second Summoner Monk, and Rescue Cat, which would trade out 2 copies for an X-Saber Airbellum, who would then tune the 2 Summoner Monks to populate your board with 2 copies of Darkstrike Fighter. With 2600 attack and the ability to tribute a monster to inflict burn damage equal to 200 times the tribute's level, you could attack with both Darkstrike Fighters and then tribute both for a fatal sum of exactly 8,000 points. This strategy would
Ooh.
lead to both Darkstrike Fighter and Rescue Cat catching bans and later erratas, with Rescue
Ooh,
Cat
that's
being
mean.
unplayable from 2010 to its reprint in the 2017 set Duelist Saga, with the new stipulation that the monster it summons are unable to activate their effects. It's worth noting that although this change wouldn't prevent Darkstrike Fighter's game-winning effect, an errata to make the effect a hard once per turn would finish Synchro Cat for good. Rescue Cat might not have risen to competitive prominence until the tail end of classic Yu-Gi-Oh! But its outsized
well.
impact in the final days before the advent of Synchros and its unparalleled OTK ability during the early Synchro era well earned it a spot at number 6 on this list. And mobilizing to number 5, we have Cyber Valley, the level 1 light machine that manages to be overpowered with no attack or defense by having 3 powerful draw effects to make up for its missing stat line.
Oh?
Entering the TCG as part of the 2008's Phantom Darkness set, Cyber Valley immediately saw play for its high degree of versatility. There's just a lot of things you can do with this card, so let's break them down. To start off,
Do
its
tell.
0 stats aren't a problem because when an opponent's monster attacks Cyber Valley, you can activate its effect first to banish itself, draw a card, and force your opponent to end their battle phase. This alone is already pretty decent utility.
That's
although
just
it won't
one
protect you
effect.
from effect removal before the battle phase, but you can make moves using Cyber Valley's 2 and 3 effects during your turn too. Those effects are to either banish Cyber Valley and another monster you control to draw 2 cards, or to banish Cyber Valley and a card from your hand to place a card from your graveyard on top of your deck. This adaptable draw power gives Cyber Valley an immediate function in Exodia decks. Able to both
Oh
deplete
yeah,
the
I can
deck
see that.
and recycle cards from the grave, a well-timed Cyber Valley could save your combo from an Exodia piece stuck in the graveyard. Being a level 1 machine, Cyber Valley can work together with a ton of different support cards, including 1-for-1 Damage Condenser, and of course, Machine Duplication, plus more.
Right.
And this brings us to Dimension Fusion. Dimension Fusion has been banned since 2008 with no indications returning, and Cyber Valley is one of the cards that broke it. Since Dimension Fusion has both players summon back as many of their banished monsters as possible, Cyber Valley plus Machine Duplication and Dimension Fusion equals a wild amount of draws. Combined with spell economics to negate the life point cost of Dimension Fusion, Cyber Valley can pull off an Exodia FTK where its third effect can recycle Dimension Fusion for it to recycle Cyber Valley for it to recycle Dimension Fusion, ad infinitum, until Exodia Obliterate. There are 1,000
God,
ways
that
to
card
make
is such a
Fusion work in the
menace.
game. But unlike that spell, Cyber Valley made it through 2008 and remained relevant as a niche tech option for many strategies in the years to come. You can find Cyber Valley in deck lists for Chaos and even the last entry Synchro Cat, but most often
It always
in color
circles
deck
back to
decks.
chaos.
Used by the Cyber Dragon duelist Zane Truesdale, Cyber Valley makes its on-field appearance in episode 148 of the Yu-Gi-Oh! GX anime during Zane's duel against the Yubel-possessed Jesse Anderson, where it would help Zane bide for time and plays, but unfortunately not enough to save him from losing the duel. Interestingly, this
And
card's
dying.
name is likely a mistranslation on account of the similarities between R and the L sounds in Romanized Japanese. Cyber Valley's name in the OCG is actually Cyber Vary, short for variation, which probably refers to
That
the
makes
variable
sense.
ways you can use the card to arrange and pull from your deck. And at number 4, we have Thousand Eyes Restrict. A
Ooh,
level 1
yeah.
Dark Fiend with 0 attack and defense, this fusion monster and cover card from the 2002 set Pharaoh Servant
Ooh,
put its
Restrict
impact
is
on
such
the
a
game deserving
bastard.
of the ace monster of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Anime's first major antagonist. Thousand Eyes Restrict was the first fusion monster in Yu-Gi-Oh! To print with an effect, and it came out of the gate swinging so hard that it actually would be banned for about a decade, from 2006 to 2016.
I
Its
think I
release
ended up
back in
selling my
Legal
copy
Play
of
is
Restrict.
secretly referenced on the card art for the
Again,
continuous
another
Collapse
stupid
Summon
thing.
Cave, which shows a confusingly adorable Thousand Eyes Restrict bidding fond farewell to the other banned cards as it's released from quarantine. But what made it so ban-worthy in the first place? Well, it's a powerful walking floodgate that prevents other monsters from changing battle positions and declaring attacks. On top of that, Thousand Eyes Restrict can target an opponent's monster and absorb it as an equip card, gaining stats equal to that monster's attack and defense. While it
Yep.
doesn't have any effect destruction protections, making it vulnerable to spells like Geki and Dark Hole, if it would be destroyed by battle, it can
It
send
would
the
just
equipped
destroy
monster
the equipped
instead,
monster.
freeing it up to suck up another new creature for its juicy attack. Unsurprisingly, this battle protection effect doesn't come into play as much as the other effects, but locking opponent's monsters in attack position does help open the option to attack into an opponent's stronger monster, and
Yeah.
then equip the attack target during your main phase 2 if you haven't already used Restrict's equip effect that turn. Thousand Eyes Restrict's powerful effect is in part justified by the fact that one of its materials is the ritual monster
Relinquished.
which was probably intended to make Restrict harder to access. But by virtue of being an unfuture-proofed level 1 fusion, Thousand Eyes Restrict is very simple to cheat onto the field. Banned in the modern game, this spell Metamorphosis tributes a monster to special summon a monster at the same level from the fusion deck. Since tokens are commonly level 1, Metamorphosis
So you could use a
token
token.
into Thousand Eyes Restrict is a common strategy in GOAT format, where Metamorphosis is still legal. Magical Scientist is banned in both the modern game and GOAT. Otherwise, it'd be another way to crank out Restrict. You can even use Cyberstein's expensive effect if you're desperate. But why was Thousand Eyes Restrict banned in 2006? Metamorphosis, Magical Scientist, and even Cyberstein
Yeah, I wonder why.
didn't exist at the time of the format. Well, look no further than Instant Fusion, a card that was printed in 2006 Cyberdark Impact set. This normal spell would instantly summon a level 5 or lower fusion monster from your extra deck at the paltry cost of 1,000 life points.
Which
That
is
monster would be
cheap.
destroyed during the end phase, but because Instant Fusion counted as a fusion summon, it could be summoned back. Playable at 3 until 2020, Instant Fusion is now limited to 1 copy in the TCG, as free bodies and fusion monsters both only got stronger with time. While Thousand Eyes Restrict is still a fine choice for your instant fusion, there are more options you might consider now. Like Elder Entity Norden, who can summon a tuner monster or level 4 for a Synchro or Xyz play, or Invoked Ragin, who can circumvent instant fusion's self-destruction drawback. Thousand Eyes Restrict has actually gained more places synergized with instant fusion, since you're now able to instantly fuse into Restrict, steal an opponent's monster, and then link restrict off into relinquish anima to potentially swipe another. After its 2016 banning, Thousand Eyes Restrict continued to see competitive play, with roles in many different decks, including Orcus, Thunder Dragon, Spiral, and more. It even had an easy to pull off lock with the spirit monster Tsukiyomi, which could flip it face
Nice.
down and free it from its equipped monster, allowing you to flip it face up, pull off another steal, and then recycle Tsukiyomi near the end phase when the spirit monster bounces itself. Its one anime appearance came in episode 39 of Duel Monsters during the final duel of Duel's Kingdom between Yugimoto and Maximilian Pegasus.
Yep.
After hitting the field and immobilizing Yugi's monsters, Pegasus attempted to use Thousand Eyes Restrict effect to absorb Magician of Black Chaos, but would fail when Yugi activated Multiply to bury the Elder
With the
Scrolls
anime
Odyssey in
nonsense.
explosive Karibos. And at number 3, it's no lie. For this list, we have Honest, a level 4 light fairy with 1100 attack and 1900 defense from 2008's Light of Destruction set. Like many of Yu-Gi-Oh's most powerful cards, Honest is a monster that can reactively activate its effect from the hand. A hand trap.
Honest
if you will.
is ridiculously
During the damage step, when
powerful.
a light monster you control battles, you can discard Honest as a quick effect to have your monster gain attack equal to the attack of its opposing combatant until the end of the turn. This essentially turns a losing battle into a direct attack on your opponent's life points that their monster won't survive. It's almost like a combined Magic Cylinder and Sakuretsu Armor, but way better because you don't have to worry about Honest getting cleared.
It's
by
a hand
bad
trap.
bugs like Mystical Space Typhoon and Cosmic Cyclone. Predictably, Honest saw large amounts of competitive play soon after its release, extending even into the modern years. Honest's competitive relevance rises and falls to coincide with the strength of light decks, since those are the strategies it can work with. It's seen consistent use in most light strategies to carve out a place in the meta, including Light Sworns, Agents, Cosmos, Bujins, Stellar Knights, Trickstars, and more. Even Chaos variants of dark strategies like Shaddolls, and by one brave top 8 duelist from Minnesota Regional 2014, a Chaos strategy built around
Even in
Saphira, Queen of
2014.
Dragons. While Honest's
Nice.
hand effect is definitely the one that had people sliding it in their decks, Honest's on-field effect is a nice complement. During your main phase, you can bounce Honest from the field back to your hand. So, if you revive an Honest that
Ooh.
you have sitting in the grave, you can recall it back to prepare for another damage step discard. Honest
Oh,
was a pivotal card in character
right.
of the 4th season of the Yu-Gi-Oh! GX anime. Originally being the dual spirit partner to the Obelisk Blue student named Yusuke Fujiwara, Honest's card was removed from Yusuke's deck purposefully to protect it from the corrupting forces of the deep darkness that Yusuke was studying. This doesn't go particularly well, and after corrupted Yusuke goes missing, Honest masquerades as the AWOL student. In episode 159, Jaden sees through this, and in episode 160, Honest is forced to flee back into its card after getting hurt by Truman, who duels Jaden and ultimately loses when Honest's effect lets Jaden's Elemental Hero Neo speed over 5-headed dragon. In episode 176, Jaden and Jesse Anderson engage in a triangle duel with Yusuke, who is corrupted by Night Shroud, but they're ultimately able to banish Yusuke's darkness by returning the spirit of Honest to him. Interestingly, the qualifications for the anime effect of Honest are that the target must be a level 7 or higher warrior rather than a light monster, but the only targets that benefit from Honest's effect in the show were Elemental Hero Neos and Rainbow Neos.
There we go. That looks
who
so
are
much
both
better.
a light attribute anyway. What's that tapping at the chamber door? That would be this list's number 2, Yatagarasu, the level 2 Wind Fiend Spirit with 200 attack, 100 defense, and almost 20 years on the Forbidden list. First printed in the 2003 set Legacy of Darkness, Yatagarasu is often thought to be the reason Yu-Gi-Oh's Forbidden list was created, though Sangan and Witch of the Black Forest caught their ban slightly earlier.
Yeah.
Still, despite being limited to one copy from the start, it was quickly apparent that one copy of Yatagarasu
Was way too much.
many, and halfway through 2004, Yatagarasu was forbidden, and there would remain, ironically, locked out of the game for the sin of locking other players out of the game until 2022, when Konami dabbled with the releasing Yatagarasu at one copy, before eventually letting the infamous Spirit Bird flourish at 3, where it
Nice.
remains today. But Yata's freedom is tenuous at best, and all it takes is the right card to break the bird and it would definitely find itself rebanned. And that's because Yatagarasu's effect is devious. When it inflicts battle damage to your opponent, they lose their next draw phase. This is obviously brutal, and the idea behind the Yatalock strategies that locked down World Championships in 2003, which was to combine the board-breaking cards like Dark Hole, Harvey's Feather Duster, Heavy Storm, and Raigeki with spell and trap card negation in the form of Jin Zone and Imperial Order to clear a path for Yatagarasu to attack directly. With their boards decimated and draw lost, if the opponent hadn't a hope in hand, then there would go the game. Yatagarasu's spirit effect of bouncing
Just preventing your opponent from drawing is a sin.
Since your opponent
But
couldn't beat over
it is
Yatagarasu
fun.
during their turn, after suffering the draw log. Not only is the legacy of Yatagarasu part of the reason why Konami is hesitant to print cards that skip your opponent's draw phase, but the legacy of Yatagarasu is also a trap card that lets you draw more cards. Usually only one card, making it almost just a cooler Jar of Greed, but if your opponent controls a spirit monster, you get to draw 2 instead. Hey, now that Ahibo Lord of the River is in Duel Links and you can make your opponent's monster become spirits, maybe the legacy of Yatagarasu's double draw will be good there, but probably not. There's also the spiritual retrain of the Bird Spirit to Magispector Crowyata, that's worth mentioning as well, plus the Ore of Yasaka that Yatagarasu is depicted holding, and its cameo appearance in Tour Bust of the Forbidden Realms, alongside fellow Forbidden Card Zangan, Rescue Cat, Cyberstein, Medical Scientist, Mistake, and Tribe-Infecting Virus.
Oof.
There's actually even a sequel to the card called Shared Ride that includes the Angel from Graceful Charity and one of the Delinquent Duo. Yatagarasu has one anime appearance in episode 117 of the Duel Monsters anime, used by Noah Kaiba against Yamayugi near the end of the Virtual World arc. With Yugi only having a set monster to defend his life points, Noah summons Yatagarasu with the intention of draw locking the Pharaoh, but this would ultimately fail since Noah's Shinato, King of Higher Plane,
I barely
had
remember
too much
that.
attack to destroy Yugi's set obnoxious Celtic Guardian. And sharing the number 1 spot on this list are 2 wildly powerful low attack monsters from the classic era of Yu-Gi-Oh! That do pretty close to the same thing. Since they have similar functions, they'll hold this spot higher, and we're pretty confident that no other card will be able to special summon itself to take it from them. And yep, the number 1 spot goes to the summoning floodgates on legs, Fossil Dyna Pachycephalo, and Jiaojin the Spiritualist. Pachycephalo is a level 4 Earth Rock with 1200 attack and 1300 defense, and Jiaojin is a level 3 Light Spellcaster with 200 attack and 1300 defense. While Pachycephalo is generally considered to be a better monster, it didn't release until May of 2008 with Lighted Destruction, while Jiaojin the Spiritualist released back in March 2003's Labyrinth of Nightmare set. They're
2003,
both absolutely
nice.
part of classic Yu-Gi-Oh!, but it feels wrong to talk about one without the other, so let's dive into both floodgates. Fossil Dyna Pachycephalo and Jiaojin the Spiritualist have the powerful lingering effect of locking both players out of special summoning any monsters. While neither is on the field, normal summons and sets are the only way to go. Additionally, both monsters have a board clearing effect, allowing them to destroy all special summon monsters in the field. Pachycephalo's destruction has no cost, but requires Pachycephalo to be flipped face up from face down defense mode. This can be accomplished on your own with cards like Book of Taiyu, or by baiting your opponent into making the mistake of attacking your set monster. Jiaojin the Spiritualist destruction effect can be activated during your main phase, but at a cost since it specifies that you must randomly discard a card from your hand. This
That's
state
fair.
of discarding can often be mitigated by running cards that like to live in the grave, but the randomness of Jiaojin's Toll makes this workaround difficult, because as many cards as you play that don't mind to discard, you'll have cards you'd rather hang on to as well. But downsides aside, the fact that both Pachycephalo and Jiaojin can simply be normal summoned and have their floodgates in effect is hugely useful. And there are many ways to get them onto the field too, including the elemental battle searchers we discussed back towards the bottom of this list, if you're playing a time-gated format without better options. Despite their strength, Fossil Dyna Pachycephalo and Jiaojin the Spiritualist have never caught a ban or even a limitation, well outside of Master Duel, and that's because neither of these cards are going to win you the game on their own. Instead, their function tends to work best within an anti-meta deck. Basically, they slow down the pace of the game, which is never alone going to be enough to score a win-win, but can stay your execution against a cracked deck, giving you the space you need to breathe and not lose. As a result, Pachycephalo and Jiaojin tend to coincide with formats where a deck they counter is essentially dominant. Commonly, they find space in the side deck over main decks, since they usually don't directly contribute towards your win conditions.
That's
but
fair.
It can be worth slotting in during games 2 and 3 against an opponent that hugely outpaces you in terms of combo speed. While stun decks that utilize Fossil Dyna Pachycephalo, Jiaojin the Spiritualist, and other powerful floodgate cards are not often considered to be particularly fun to play against, they can still play a vital role within the ecosystem of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Meta as counters to breakneck decks that nevertheless fold against cooler strategies. Both Jiaojin and Pachycephalo have anime appearances, with Jiaojin being used by the Spirit of the Millennium Ring against Yamayugi in episode 84 of the Duel Monsters anime, and Jim Crocodile Cook summoning Fossil Dyna Pachycephalo against the Supreme King during episode 139 of the Yu-Gi-Oh! GX anime. Interestingly, in what has become a trend for many of the cards on this list, both duelists lose their matches. The blanket special summon floodgate effect that both of these cards are able to access was powerful at the time they were printed, and has only gotten stronger at the time. Some decks rely on spells, while some rely on traps. Some lean heavily on the extra deck, while others go all in on their main. But one mechanic that almost all decks in Yu-Gi-Oh! Share is special summoning, and Jiaojin and Pachycephalo's ability to wall that option with just a normal summon makes them easy candidates for the #1 spot on this list. In this
Yeah.
video, we'll be going over 10 cards which have had such a drastic effect on the game that it either changed how players play the game or had the game change around them. And at number 10, we have Infinite Impermanence. This is a
What's
card
this
that
one?
has both a hand and on-field effect, where if you have an empty field, you can use it from your hand to negate the effects of a monster. And if it's on the field and activated like a normal trap card, it also has the same effect to negate the effect of a monster, but gains an additional effect, where for the rest of the turn, it negates the effects of all spell and trap cards in the same column as it. So with Infinite Impermanence, the way this card changed the game was not in its hand effect, because it's basically just another version of Effect Veiler. And actually, it's its on-field effect, which makes it so you're incentivized to not play spell and traps in the same column as your opponent's face-down spell and trap cards, because you never know if they're going to have an Infinite Impermanence in that zone and be able to negate your effect. To a lesser extent,
yeah.
the Mech Knights also incentivize you to not play spell and traps in the same column as your opponent's spell and traps, but Infinite Impermanence is one of the most played hand traps in the game, and definitely is more influential in making people not play spell and traps in the same column as their opponents. Even if your opponent doesn't have Infinite Impermanence, people will still avoid playing cards in the same column as your opponent's face-down cards, just because Infinite Impermanence exists. These are the kinds of cards we'll be talking about on this list. Cards that have such an impact that they influence how you play the game, even if they don't actually exist in your opponent's deck. And at number 9, we have Nibiru, the Primal Being. This is another pretty new card, even newer than Infinite Impermanence as it only came out in 2019. And
I'm trying to
has the
think if I
effect
still
where
have a
if your
copy of
opponent
this card.
summons 5 or more monsters during the main phase, you can then activate this card from your hand to tribute all monsters on the field, give your opponent a super token that has all the stats of the tributed monsters, and then you get to special summon Nibiru from your hand. Being able to tribute all the monsters in the field can kind of win you the game by itself in most cases,
Yeah.
and it's an incredibly powerful hand trap effect. So the way this card changes the game is that if you're trying to get out a whole bunch of monsters, chances are you're going to count how many summons you're doing during that turn, and then think twice before performing your 5th summon. If you don't have a way to negate Nibiru by the time you have your 5th summon, and you don't know what card's in your opponent's hand, there is a chance you might just stop there, even if your opponent doesn't have a Nibiru, just in case they do. It also incentivizes people to try to get out and negate as early as possible in their combos if they want to extend past 5 summons, even if it would make their combos less efficient. Nibiru is another excellent example of a card which completely warps the game around itself, and really helps to slow down the potential of combo decks, and kind of completely counters archetypes that don't have a way to answer Nibiru natively. Just like Infinite Impermanence, there's a good chance your opponent will play around Nibiru, even if you don't actually have the card in your hand. And at number 8, we have number 101, Silent Honor Arc. This is a rank 4 Xyz monster, which simply has the effect where it can detach 2 of its materials to absorb one of your opponent's face-up attack position special summoned monsters. In which case it becomes one of this card's new materials, and this card has another effect where if it would be destroyed, you can detach one of its materials instead. Since Honor Arc had generic level 4 materials, it was one of the first non-destruction removal extract monsters that players got access to when it came out, and that made it an absolute powerhouse for removing destruction immune cards, like Stardust Dragon for example. And what was so influential about Silent Honor Arc was that it was such a good removal boss monster that it kind of incentivized people to summon their cards in defense position. Because Honor Arc only worked on face-up attack position cards. So if you simply summon that monster into defense position, then it couldn't be absorbed with Honor Arc. So even if your opponent didn't have Silent Honor Arc in their extra deck, during this card's heyday, most players would summon their boss monster in defense positions that they didn't want their opponent to steal anyway. Nowadays, people still kind of do this, but because of Lightning Storm and not Honor Arc. Lightning Storm can destroy all your opponent's face-up attack position monsters, and it's a great going second card. So it reintroduced the popularity of summoning your big boss monster in defense position if it wasn't destruction immune. Even if no one really uses number 101 Silent Honor Arc anymore, it was the first card that popularized summoning a monster in defense position. And at number 7, we have Evenly Matched. This is a trap card which can only be activated at the end of the battle phase if your opponent controls more cards than you do, where you then make your opponent banish the number of cards they control so that they control the same number of cards as you do. Oh, and also, if you don't control any cards, you can activate this card from your hand. Now, Evenly Matched is such a powerful card that it almost single-handedly popularized the going second deck. Before Evenly Matched, going first was always the better choice. It was so good that Konami had to limit how powerful going first was, through changing the rules of the game where you can no longer draw a card during your first turn. Even with that change, it was still incredibly powerful, and going second was just a detriment, as win percentages heavily favored whoever went first. Evenly Matched was a start of cards that are so good if you're able to go second with them, that there are legitimate versions of the same decks that either want to go first or go second. If your opponent set up a full board of monsters or a combination of a lot of cards in the back row, but they didn't have a way to negate trap effects, then you can gain a ton of advantage by making your opponent get rid of all their cards. The removal from Evenly Matched forces your opponent to get rid of their cards and banish them face down, which is probably one of the best forms of removal, as it
Yeah.
bypasses almost all kinds of protection. Not even Ultimate Falcon is immune to the effects of Evenly Matched. And if you use the effect from your hand, you can just simply enter the battle phase, and then leave the battle phase to get rid of all but one of your opponent's cards, since it counts your Evenly Matched in the field as your one card. Then you can do all your plays like normal during the main phase 2 in order to set up your board. You do have to give up your main phase 1 and battle phase to use the card, but the amount of
That's
advantage
fair.
you gain from wiping your opponent's entire field of indestructible monsters is kinda worth it. Evenly Matched was then followed by some more good going second cards, which made the strategy way more viable than trying to rely on just drawing a copy of Evenly Matched, thanks to cards like Dark Ruler No More and of course Lightning Storm. Evenly Matched was influential in the fact that it made going second advantageous, where multiple people playing going second decks
It always feels
didn't
better to
go
go
first
second.
at all, which was rarely a thing before Evenly Matched was released. And at number 6, we have Maxi. This is a hand trap which was released in 2011 and has the effect where you can use this during either player's turn, and you gain the effect for the rest of the turn where each time your opponent special summons a monster, you
I
get
don't
to draw
remember if
one
I've
card.
had this card before.
Maxi is easily the strongest hand trap in the game's history, and it's kind of funny that when the card first came out, it rarely saw competitive play. It did see some competitive play, but it wasn't until later on where the problems of the card really became apparent, and the card got banned for just being too influential in its power. Basically, Maxi is so powerful that it changes the game around itself, kind of like Nibiru the Primal Being. The game literally just slows down if Maxi exists in the game, because if you start special summoning your monsters and your opponent drops a Maxi, they can chain it in response to you about to special summon a card, in order to immediately gain the advantage back of using that Maxi. So even if you stop your turn immediately so your opponent can't draw a whole bunch of cards, then you don't actually lose any advantage for using the Maxi, which is not the case for pretty much every other hand trap. And also, if you stop your turn so that your opponent doesn't draw a whole bunch for Maxi, you're basically stopping your turn early thanks to the effect of one card. It simultaneously allows you to force your opponent to stop special summoning for the rest of the turn while not losing hand advantage and potentially forcing your opponent to skip their turn, which is one of the most powerful effects in the game. Currently, Maxi is banned in the TCG and unbanned in the OCG, and the game is basically warped around Maxi in the OCG. Maxi just increases the power level of control decks that don't like to special summon a lot. It makes cards which can directly counter Maxi way more viable and necessary to open up with first if you don't want to lose to that one card, like a Call by the Grave or Crossout Designator. Maxi basically creates a game state where you need to have a counter for the card, otherwise you're going to lose out on your turn. And there's no real playing around the card like you can with Nibiru, unless you're able to special summon a whole bunch of times during your turn in order to deck out your opponent by taking the Maxi challenge, which was even mentioned in an official manga chapter. And at number 5, we have Cyber Dragon.
Yeah,
is a level 5
Cyber
monster,
Dragon.
which can special summon itself from your hand if your opponent controls a monster.
It's a simple
Now,
effect, but it's
definitely
good.
nowhere near as powerful as Maxi, but it was a game changer, and this list is all about cards which change the game and not about the power level of the cards themselves. However, Cyber Dragon, when it was first released in 2005, was kind of overpowered in its time period.
Just being able to special
2005
summon a
was
monster
still the
this
era of
powerful.
1900 attack beat sticks, and where tribute summons were still common, even if Summon Skull Beatdown wasn't a competitive deck anymore. So if your
Nice.
opponent summoned out a big 1900 attack beat stick, then you could bring out Cyber Dragon and instantly beat over it, while you just normal summon your own 1900 attack beat stick, and your opponent would have a hard time getting back from that loss of advantage. Cyber Dragon was so oppressive as a free monster you can bring out from your hand, back in the time when special summons were still pretty rare, that some people would just straight up not summon monsters during their first turn if they didn't have an answer to
Just
a
in
potential
case.
Cyber Dragon. Cyber Dragon was also just used as tribute fodder, that way they can go into bigger boss monsters like Jinzo, and can be used later on in the graveyard for cards like Chaos Sorcerer, since it was light attribute. And since Cyber Dragon acted as both a powerful free card to get on the field in order to extend, or just a really strong card to use as tribute fodder, the rest of the game kind of had to catch up to Cyber Dragon's power level. Cyber
Yeah.
Dragon was absolutely a staple card. It was even limited on the ban list for a while during the Synchro era, because it was too strong at 3 copies, but never strong
Oh,
enough
yeah,
that
I
it was
can
banned for a
definitely
bit.
see that.
Then Cyber Dragon got a lot of support later on in its life, which led it to be a normal card in a rogue meta deck. So sure, most people today know of Cyber Dragon since it still sees competitive play, but probably don't remember how absolutely game-changing it was when it came out. Its power level was so high that the rest of the game had to catch up to it in a hurry, and popularized the use of special summoning monsters from your hand for combos as a normal part of the game. And at number 4, we have That Grass Looks Greener. This is a spell card which allows
Not
you to send a number of
familiar with
cards from
this
your deck
card.
to the graveyard equal to the surplus difference in your deck size to your opponents. So if you had 60 cards in your deck and your opponent had 40, you could send the top 20 cards of your deck to the graveyard. And with how many ridiculously good graveyard effects there are in the game, sending the top 20 cards of your deck to the graveyard could be equivalent to going plus 20 in card advantage. So it's an incredibly good effect to get off. Which is why when That Grass Looks Greener was legal in the TCG, people were playing cards like Left Arm Offering, which gets rid of your entire hand to search out one spell card, just to search it out, and it was absolutely worth that cost.
Wow.
Now, the way this card changed the game was popularizing the use of 60-card decks, which is still sometimes a thing in the modern game, but it was a different story when That Grass Looks Greener was still legal, because That Grass Looks Greener decks could gain so much advantage for just resolving a single card, that a good way to counter the card was to just play 60-card decks yourself. If you had a 60-card deck, then your opponent wouldn't really get anything from resolving That Grass Looks Greener, and you could
Nope.
completely counter the whole point of their deck during the deck building process. And because of this, a lot of decks just started playing the max cap of 60, even if they didn't want to. And decks which could take advantage of having more than 40 cards were performing a lot better in this era, of more and more people just running 60-card decks to counter That Grass Looks Greener. Grass was so strong it changed how people constructed their decks, and I think this is a first, where people changed the amount of cards they played in their deck because of one card in the game. Even if
Wow.
your opponent didn't have That Grass Looks Greener, chances are you would go against another person who also had a 60-card deck, not because they were playing the card, but because they were trying to counter it as well. After That Grass Looks Greener finally
Which
got
is funny.
banned, 60-card decks basically disappeared overnight. They still exist, don't get me wrong, but only if they directly can benefit from having that many cards, as it's still better to run the minimum amount possible so that you can actually draw the combo pieces you need. And at number 3, we have Malevolent Catastrophe. This is a trap card which has the effect that when an opponent's monster declares an attack, you can destroy all spell and trap cards in the field. So it's a full Heavy Storm-like effect.
Oh.
The way this card changed the game was how people place their spell and trap cards. You see, if your opponent has back row, or any cards in the field, or really anything at all, and you have traps or quick play spell cards you want to set to be able to use during your opponent's turn, you hold on to those before you enter the battle phase. Pretty much everyone sets their spell and trap cards during their main phase too who aren't Duel Links players, and Malevolent Catastrophe is the reason why. If you set your cards in your main phase 1, then attacking into this card, you would lose all your cards, which could easily be prevented by just waiting until your main phase 2 to set them. Raikou the Lights 100
Right.
also partially contributed to the status as well, as it was a very popular flip effect monster which could target back row in addition to monsters when it was flip face up. So if you had any set back row and you attacked into Raikou, chances are you would lose one of your spell and trap cards, because Light Sworns could just blow up your monsters pretty easily before the era of everyone having monster negates. So Malevolent Catastrophe causing people to change when they set their spell and traps is definitely deserving of a high spot on this list of cards that changed how players play
Yeah.
the game.
Yeah.
And at number 2, we have Gorz, the Emissary of Darkness. This is a card which has the effect that if you don't control any cards on your side of the field and you take damage, you can then special summon this card from your hand and activate one of its 2 effects based on the type of damage you took. Where you can either inflict damage to your opponent equal to the amount of effect damage you took, or if it was battle damage, you get to summon a token which has the same attack and defense as the amount of damage you took.
Ooh.
So the way this card changed the game was how your opponent attacks with their monsters directly during the battle phase. Since Gorz can summon a really beefy token based on the amount of damage you take, if you're attacking into your opponent directly and they have no cards in their field, and you attacked with your strongest monster first,
They're
then
gonna get
you
a
bring out
strong
Gorz and
token.
get a super strong token that none of your other monsters would be able to attack over. So the way
So
to
you would
counter
have to be
Gorz is
careful.
simply attack with your lowest attack monsters first, ascending to your highest monsters last. This will force your opponent to activate Gorz early if they're trying to bring them out to stop you from lowering their life points to 0, in which case you can more readily attack over the token and potentially Gorz himself, which has pretty beefy stats for a monster that can special summon itself from the hand. Even if Gorz doesn't really see play in the modern era, longtime Yu-Gi-Oh fans will still attack with their lower attack monsters first and higher attack monsters last, just in case. And at
Yeah.
number 1, we have Chaos Emperor Dragon. And
There he
what
is
a name.
again.
This card was so impactful that Konami basically created the forbidden list for it. The original effect of this card was you could pay 1,000 life points in order to send all cards in the field in both players' hands to the graveyard, and then inflict 300 points of damage to your opponent for each card sent to the graveyard with its effect.
Yeah,
It
that's
also
nuts.
brings itself out really easily by just banishing a light and dark monster from your graveyard. So it's one of the most powerful effects ever printed on a monster. And the best way to take advantage of this to make sure you were going to win that turn was to make sure one of the cards you sent to the graveyard was Sangan so that you could search out Yatagarasu. Then you could just summon and attack with Yatagarasu in order to make your opponent not draw cards during the next draw phase, and then just repeat infinitely until your opponent's life points reach 0.
Good lord,
Because
that's
unless
evil.
your opponent had a response in the graveyard, there was nothing they could do to come back from the combo. And generally, Konami doesn't like it when you're put in a game state where there's literally nothing you can do to come back. So they heavily restricted cards which allow you to skip your opponent's draw phase, like Yatagarasu or Time Seal. Both of these cards are still forbidden on the ban list to this day. Although Chaos Emperor Dragon was definitely the problem part of the combo, because it so easily allows you to set up an empty field in hand in order to lock down your opponent. If the card was unbanned with its original effect, it would still be one of the strongest cards in the game even today, almost 20 years after it came out. That's why the effect was changed to be a heavily nerfed version of itself, where it basically locks you out of using any card effects during the turn you use its effect, which was enough for them finally take the card off the ban list. Although the forbidden list exists in the first place because of how strong the card was, they basically had to make a way so that you could no longer use its super powerful effect at all, because this was before they would errata cards. So for creating the forbidden list, Chaos Emperor Dragon is a good spot to take number 1 on this list. In this video, we'll be going over some of the worst cards from the earliest portions of Yu-Gi-Oh!, this time going over cards from Magic Ruler and Pharaoh's Servant, the 3rd and 4th sets ever released to the TCG. And starting off at number 10, we have Final Destiny. This is a spell card which has the effect where you have to discard 5 cards from your hand in order to activate it, where you gain the effect to destroy all cards on the field. Now, at first glance, the cost for the effect seems appropriate. You're destroying all the cards in the field, of course it would cost something like discarding 5 cards from your hand. However, the amount of cost for this effect is rarely actually worth the effort. If you were going second in the time period and your opponent manages to have a full established board of cards, you'll basically have to ditch your entire hand in order to get rid of it.
Just a complete board wipe.
Nothing to extend further, since this was a time period before graveyard effects were really a thing. And there were other powerful staple cards you could use instead. In some of those first sets, they had cards like Raigeki and Dark Hole to just get rid of all the monsters, and they also had Giant Trunade and Harpy's Feather Duster to get rid of all the spells and traps. None of these cards have a cost associated with
because of that,
board wipe effects.
It just completely eliminates the use for Final Destiny,
which combines these two cards, has such a drastic discard cost of 5. Which is probably the highest discard cost of every card in the game, which specifies a specific amount of cards to discard. For the effect of discarding all 5 cards from your hand, only destroying all cards in the field is not good enough. This card should also allow you to special summon a monster from the graveyard afterwards, double your life point value, and then cut your opponent's life point value in half, and even then it might not be worth a 5-card discard, because outside of your first turn, it's kind of hard to fulfill the conditions of this card in the first place. Even though early Yu-Gi-Oh! Had cards like Pre-Errata Sinister Serpent to constantly refill your hand with discard fodder. However, it does have a pretty good effect if you just disregard that ridiculous cost, and there are very few cards that can even destroy everything on the field. So it's tentatively only at the number 10 spot on this list.
But still
pretty bad. We have Darkness Approaches. This is a spell card which has the effect where you can discard 2 cards from your hand to change one monster on the field to face down defense position without changing its battle position, and was unique in that it was one of the few cards in the game that could put a monster in face-down attack position before the card
which
was even
seems kind of pointless.
Specifically so that you couldn't use it on Link Monster. However, even in the time period when it still had a unique effect, it still never saw any competitive play because the discard cost of 2 is too high. Generally, if you're having to discard cards from your hand for an effect, it better be something amazing, like being able to search any spell card from your deck, or recovering any spell from your graveyard, not a Worse Book of Moon. That's on spell speed 1. This is another one of those early cards with a decent effect, which is too high of a cost associated for that effect. And
so
at
again,
8, we have
pointless.
Ceremonial Bell. This is a level 3 monster.
Oh, I remember Ceremonial Bell.
That has the effect where both players must keep their hands revealed. Now, this may surprise you to hear, but Ceremonial Bell is technically a floodgate. However, it has to be one of the weakest kinds of floodgates in the game. That being, your opponent just has to reveal their hand. There are certain cards in the game that require them to be revealed in the hand in order to activate their effects. So if their hand is always revealed, then they can't activate the cost of revealing the card. However, in early Yu-Gi-Oh, there weren't very many cards with this kind of effect, and the ones that did weren't very good. So I don't think it was actually intended to be a floodgate at all, and just a way to gain information on your opponent's hand. But
Yeah,
seeing
pretty
as it
much.
has 0 attack, it's kind of hard to get this card on the field in order to activate the effect immediately, as the best way to use it is setting the card face down and hoping it survives being attacked in battle, which it
So you
should be able to
basically
do with
have to
1850
wait a turn.
defense, as some of the strongest monsters at the time that didn't require tribute only had around 1800 attack. But there were much better options in the game already, most of which were vanilla monsters that didn't have an effect, which was technically better than this effect monster with a bad effect, since at least they benefited from vanilla support. And the funny thing is, they also released a trap card version of this card called Respect Play. So, if all you wanted was the effect of floodgating your opponent's hand by having it constantly revealed during their turn, then you wouldn't even need to
You would
use
just need the
Ceremonial
trap.
anyway. And at number 7, we have Curse of Fiend. This is a unique spell card which has the effect where you can change the battle position of all attack position monsters on the field to defensive position and vice versa. Additionally, these battle positions cannot be changed during the turn this card is activated, except with a card effect. So, being able to change all of your opponent's attack position monsters to defense position was not a half-bad effect in early Yu-Gi-Oh! Because
But
usually it allowed you to destroy them by battle as most strong monsters had low defense points. And it's even a normal spell card, which means you can use it during your turn in order to set up your plays to attack over all of your opponent's monsters. Or else you would be able to if it wasn't for the last restriction on this card, which states you can only activate this card during your standby phase. Now, this is another card with a unique mechanic because you can't actually use normal spell cards during your standby phase. So, one would think that if you had this card in your hand and your standby phase is happening, you're allowed to choose to use the effect during the standby phase in order to force all of your opponent's monsters to change their battle positions, but that's
right.
not actually how it works. You need to set this card on the field first like a trap card, then wait until your next standby phase where you'll have the option to use it because for some reason the rulings of this card works in a way where it has to
That
be
it would
on
be
the
a
field
trap.
first in order to activate its rule-breaking effect. However, another distinction about Curse of Fiend, since it's not an actual trap card, is that if you set this card during your standby phase with something like Dust Tornado's second effect, then you can activate the card immediately because normal spell cards can be activated during the same turn that they're set. If a card says it breaks the rules of the game, then it just breaks the rules of the game. But sometimes there's extra rules to the game for cards that break the rules of the game, like in the case of Curse of Fiend, which is kind of hilarious to think about. And at number 6, we
God.
have Bombardment Beetle. This is a level 2 flip effect insect type monster, which has the effect that when it's flipped face up, you can pick up and see one face down defense position monster your opponent controls, and if it's an effect monster, the card is destroyed. But if it's not, then it's returned to its original position and nothing happens. So
And that's
basically,
it.
this card destroys a face down monster on the field when it's flipped face up, which means it's a straight up downgrade to a card like Maneater Bug, which is also a level 2 insect type monster with a flip effect, but at least Maneater Bug
actually
can destroy a monster
destroys.
regardless of its battle position. And the reason I mentioned Maneater Bug is because Maneater Bug was released in the first set of Yu-Gi-Oh! And didn't really see much competitive play. And for some reason, they thought to release another Maneater Bug with just a worse effect that surprisingly didn't see any competitive play at all. Because even
Who would've
Maneater
thought?
Bug wasn't that great. And at number 5, we have Deep Sea Warrior. This is a level 5 monster with 1600 attack, which has the effect where, as long as the Umi field spell is face up on the field, this monster is unaffected by spell card effects, which hilariously enough means it's immune to the beneficial effects of the various Umi spell cards.
That's
However, the original
funny.
Umi spell card didn't provide an attack boost anyway, since Deep Sea Warrior is a warrior type, so this didn't matter very much for the early days of the game. And there were some pretty powerful spell effects where having immunity to their effects was beneficial, like Raigeki, Dark Hole, or even Fissure. However, Deep Sea Warrior is a level 5 monster, which means it requires 1 tribute for its summon. And at the time, the power level of level 4 monsters was around 1800, which means it couldn't compete with non-tribute summon monsters in terms of attack
It's
power,
got a
which meant
stupidly
its
low
spell immunity
attack.
was kind of useless. Because it could just be destroyed by pretty much any competitive monster in the game at the time, since the absolute lowest attack power of usable level 5 monsters was 1900, as seen with Air Knight Parshath, which saw tons of competitive play because it actually had a good effect while having a 1900 attack body in a level 5 monster. There was another level 5 monster release called the Legendary Fisherman, which also had spell immunity while Umi was face up on the field, but it also had protection for monsters as it couldn't be targeted for attacks, where your opponent could just attack you directly if it was the only card you controlled. And the Legendary
Which is
Fisherman
fine.
had a higher than 1800 attack, so it could actually compete with cards like Login, but still wasn't used because it was way too weak of a monster for requiring a specific spell card on the field, and requiring a tribute for its summon. And the Legendary Fisherman and Deep Sea Warrior were released in the same set. So if the better version of Deep Sea Warrior didn't see any play, it's probably easy to guess that Deep Sea Warrior didn't see any competitive play as well. And
Yeah.
at number 4, we have Performance of the Sword. This is a level 6 ritual monster, which doesn't have an effect, and simply has the normal ritual summoning mechanic, where you need to use its specific spell card in order to tribute monsters from your hand or field that equal or exceed its level in order to bring it out from your hand. And this
So
in of itself
it's
is
just
why
a
the
weak
card is
ritual
banned.
monster.
Because early ritual monsters were inherently clunky by requiring 2 specific cards in your hand in order to bring them out, as well as requiring tributes on top of that, where you have to go at least -2 to bring up Performance of the Sword from your hand, assuming you had all the combo pieces to do it in the first place. And for going -2, only having 1950 attack is not really worth the effort.
Yeah,
This is not the same
that's
as
pretty
something like
weak.
Darkness Approaches, which also requires a similar amount of card disadvantage in order to use the effect, because at least Darkness Approaches allows you to use any 2 cards as discard, whereas you need to have 2 specific cards in your hand to perform the ritual summon Performance of the Sword. There were 3 other ritual monsters released alongside Performance of the Sword, that being Hungry Burger, Crab Turtle, and Relinquished.
Hungry
Although
Burger.
only Relinquish has an actual effect, and it's a pretty good effect too. The other ones are all also equally terrible along the same veins as Performance of the Sword,
But they're
never
stronger.
saw any competitive play. Because rituals as a mechanic are so inherently bad that the only way to make them playable is to just actually make them broken, as seen with the Necrons and Drytron archetypes. And at number 3, we have Solomon's Logbook. This is a trap card which simply has the effect to skip your next standby phase. Now, as we all remember, the standby phase is that short phase which happens after you draw a card and before your main phase 1, and generally exists as a way for card effects to activate that you can't really interact with meaningfully outside of quick effects. Think of cards like Treeborn Frog, which come back during the standby phase. However, there is another thing that happens during the standby phase pretty regularly, and that's paying the cost for certain effects that are continuous. Around the same time Solomon's Logbook came out, they also released a card called Imperial Order, which negated all spell effects on the field, but required you to pay 700 life points during each of your standby phases.
Which is pretty
So I would
steep.
assume the intended synergy of Solomon's Logbook was to be able to skirt the cost of certain effects. Maybe something even big like Mirror Wall, which had a 2,000 life point cost during your standby phase. Or even later on with Mirage of Nightmare, which would discard up to 4 cards from your hand during your standby phase. There are some cards which can benefit from having your standby phase skipped. And even with those cards, you still probably wouldn't want to play Solomon's Logbook, because that's all it does. And
Yeah,
avoiding cost of
that's
certain
kind of
effects
pointless.
is not that big a deal. Especially not a trap card that has to exist in the field for a full turn before you're able to use it. This card kind of falls into those categories where technically it's a useful effect, but it's just not a very good one. And it's a technically good effect that requires synergy for it to do anything at all. And even then, the most useful applications of the things you can do with this is to simply avoid paying costs, which are generally not a big deal.
Yeah.
Unless it's attached to something like Mirage of Nightmare, which is currently banned. And at number 2, we have Wall Shadow. This is a level 7 monster with no effect that only has a summoning condition.
Ooh, this was a good pack.
With the effect of Magical Labyrinth first. Magical Labyrinth
Oh,
is an equipped spell card which
nice.
can only be equipped to Labyrinth Wall. And Labyrinth Wall is a level 5 normal monster with 3000 defense, so requires a tribute in order to get on the field. However, Labyrinth Wall has 0 attack. So if you equip Labyrinth Wall with Magical Labyrinth, then you can special summon out Wall Shadow from your deck, which gives you a grand total of 1600 attack points with no meaningful effect, and thus pretty bad. Remember how we talked about Deep Sea Warrior being kind of bad for a level 5 monster with 16?
Oh yeah,
attack?
Wall Shadow is
Well,
even
Wall
worse.
Shadow is much harder to bring out, because one of the combo pieces required also requires a tribute summon. And if all you want is a 3000 defense monster, you can just kind of leave Labyrinth Wall in the field instead for much less effort. And also, bringing out Wall Shadow requires you to play specific cards, which is incredibly difficult to get on the field and activate in the first place. A lot of early Yu-Gi-Oh! Required incredibly specific cards to interact with each other without real ways to search them out. So no one played those cards because they were so ridiculously inefficient to. And there was really no reason to play Wall Shadow anyway, unless you were to combo with something like Spike Shield with Chain, so it could gain 1600 defense boost if it's tacked. Or maybe even Magnum Shield, since it's technically a warrior type monster, which can
But at this
increase
point, we're
its
just getting
attack by its
technical with all
defense.
these.
So Magnum Shield can give the wall a 3000 attack boost, which is significant for an equipped spell card. but both of these cards are released over 10 years after Wall Shadow was. So if you really want to make the best use of Wall Shadow for some kind of PvE deck, Magnum Shield is definitely the way to go, which was just not a thing when this card first came out.
Nice.
And at number 1, we have Drill Bug. This is a level 2 monster with 1100 attack, which is actually kind of high for a level 2 monster. But it has the effect that if it inflicts battle damage to your opponent, you can select a specific card named Parasite from your deck, and then place that card on top of your deck. So basically, it's a
But
searcher
you need
for
Parasite.
but it doesn't even add the card to your hand, and requires it to inflict damage first. Normally, a searcher just adds the card from your deck to your hand on their summon, or that's how it became normal later on in Yu-Gi-Oh! Likely, Drillbug was one of the first archetype searches in the game, which could explain why it did its search very poorly. And the card it searched out, Parasite, wasn't even that good either. As what it did was have the effect that if it was flip face up and survived the battle, you could then add this card to your opponent's deck face up. Where if your opponent drew the card, then it would special summon itself immediately, inflict 1000 points of damage to its controller, and then turn all the monsters the player controlled into insect-type monsters. So a synergy could be stated that if you give Drillbug to your opponent after you set up your opponent with Parasite, then attack into Drillbug with a low attack monster you control to inflict damage, forcing your opponent to search out Parasite to put on top of their deck, this could be a convoluted way of getting the intended purpose of searching the card out for your opponent. Maybe.
Yeah, but still, it is a
effect
convoluted
optional, so they can just choose not
attempt.
to do that. 2 years later, they would release a support card for Parasite called Jade Insect Whistle, which simply forces your opponent to search out one insect-type monster and then place that card on top of their deck, which still doesn't really solve the problem of Parasite
Yeah, no, not
being
really.
very good for all the effort it requires in order to set up and use properly, something that wasn't solved until Duel Links came out, where there was literally a skill that just added the cards to your opponent's deck at the start of the duel, rendering Drillbug completely useless, and Parasite actually useful, even though it wasn't super useful beforehand. I will say, Jade Insect Whistle absolutely saw play in Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Links because that 1000 life point burn was actually a bigger deal when your life points only started off at 4000, rather than normal Yu-Gi-Oh! Where 1000 life point burn is not worth the effort. If Parasite did double the amount of damage, it still wouldn't be worth the effort to activate for its burn damage alone, outside of using a skill to auto-include it into your opponent's deck. In this video, looking at some of the earliest sets of the game. More specifically, Pharaonic Guardian and Magician's Force.
Okay, so I am actually going to stop right here. 12 days into the card shop. And yeah, we've made a good amount of progress, I'd say. Got 2 different expansions, or 2 different sets out, some card sleeves, 3 tables, card tables, some rare cards, and 1 air freshener. But yeah, not bad for almost a 2-week start to this. There are still a couple of things that I want to buy as soon as I level up more. And I have not expanded the store yet, because let's see. Yep, I can expand the store at least 5 times, but I think once I reach, what is it, I need $1,800 and I can get like a full row expansion from here to here. So next time I stream, that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to go ahead and try and get the $1,800 I need to just try and clear out this section. But yeah, all right. Depending on how things go once this stream is finished, I'll see if I can continue on with having the dual logs videos out, because it's nice just to listen about all the different Yu-Gi-Oh card facts and all that, and yeah, it's just a nice little listen. Because really, there's not much I can talk about with this game until more stuff has been added. And besides, I like listening to other card and Yu-Gi-Oh stuff. So I think with that, that'll be it for today, and I'll come back to streaming again whenever. So, thank you all so much for watching, and I will catch you all later. Bye!